Hey guys, tonight we begin when Victorian ladies held pineapple parties. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Uvea wouldn't expect a fruit to become a status symbol, let alone the cause of financial folly. Social pageantry and an entire subculture of high society gossip, but in Victorian Britain, the pineapple was not merely fruit, it was a spectacle. Its statement. A luxury so rare and revered that to ignore merely display, one could elevate your reputation faster than an arranged marriage or a well-placed donation to the church. To understand why Victorian ladies gathered to admire pineapples, we need to go back further to the late 18th century, before pineapples graced tablecloths and parlor windows in Britain, and before pineapple motifs adorned everything from stoneware to wallpaper. The British were not unfamiliar with exotic produce, thanks to their expanding empire and colonial trade networks. But the pineapple, a spiny, golden tropical fruit native to South America, was a different kind of exotic. It didn't just come from far away. Came from a world so alien, its presence alone hinted at the mastery of lands, seas, and climate. Growing or possessing a pineapple in the cool fog of England became the horticultural equivalent of owning a unicorn. By the mid-18th century, aristocratic estates began experimenting with elaborate glass structures, called pineries, greenhouses specifically designed to mimic tropical conditions. These were incredibly expensive to build and maintain. Was burned continuously to heat the air. And specialized gardeners were hired to manage soil pH, water ratios, and air circulation with obsessive precision. Often these efforts yielded just 1 or 2 pineapples a year. Naturally, this rarity bred a feverish admiration among the upper classes. Pineapples became the piece de resistance of feasts, never eaten, merely displayed. To serve a pineapple even, if rented at a dinner party, was a show of opulence. And yes, pineapples were indeed rented. In London, fruit rental services became a quiet industry. For a fee, one could rent a ripe pineapple to be the centerpiece of a banquet. The fruit would be placed prominently, often atop a silver pedestal. In the middle of the table, surrounded by less prestigious fruits like apples and pears, the pineapple would make the rounds of several events over a week, sometimes longer, until it began to rot. Only then, when its glamour had faded, would the owner finally eat it. Guests weren't fooled. Everyone knew the pineapple on display was likely rented and possibly already viewed by many others, but no one said a word. Politeness, after all, was the currency of the drawing room. What mattered was that the hostess had managed to acquire one at all. Ladies who couldn't afford to rent a real pineapple might commission an artificial one sculpted from wax or carved from wood, and painted carefully to resemble the real thing. A good fake could sustain one's social standing for months. The risk of being discovered as a fraud was ever present. It was not unlike wearing false pearls or using imitation lace. The image mattered, but the deception was dangerous. The cultural explosion around pineapples was so intense that it filtered into other parts of society. Pineapple motifs began appearing in household decor on candlesticks, on chairbacks, and even embroidered into curtains. Public buildings, especially in colonial ports, featured pineapple carvings on door frames and railings. The fruit came too, symbolize hospitality, elegance, and worldly reach. It was during this same period that the first known pineapple party took place. The date is unclear, sometime in the early 1800s, but the event is described in the private letters of Lady Elizabeth Hope of Bath. She wrote with giddy awe to her cousin in Yorkshire about an evening of curious delight, wherein the pineapple, whole and resplendent, was unveiled upon a silken cloth before the gaslights of the parlor, and a gathering of no fewer than 20 gentleladies took turns sketching its spines and sipping cordial and reverent admiration. No one ate the pineapple. It would have ruined the whole point. Instead, the fruit was treated like a visiting dignitary or a museum artifact. Guests circled it, sometimes touching the tough skin with a gloved hand. Some brought small journals and attempted pencil sketches, Others, less artistically inclined, simply stared and murmured admiration. One guest reportedly remarked that the pineapple looked like it had been kissed by sun gods and carved by angels. These gatherings began to gain popularity across the country, especially among middle-class women who wanted a taste, however symbolic, of upper-class grandeur. Invitations were often handwritten and decorated with drawings of tropical leaves or sun rays. The host would provide tea, biscuits, light music, and sometimes a lecture about the origin of pineapples in the New World, which itself was usually a cascade of colonial exaggerations and botanical myths. The parties became so popular that an etiquette around them developed. You never asked how the hostess had acquired her pineapple. You did not request to taste it, and above all, you never commented on its ripeness or color. Doing so might imply that the hostess had received the fruit secondhand or at the tail end of its rental life. Pineapple admiration became a kind of ritualized envy, a beautiful fruit with sharp armor, costly and difficult to obtain, which nevertheless must be admired only from a distance. What could be more British? These gatherings, though seemingly frivolous, tell us much about the social fabric of the time. Women often denied formal education or public influence, carved out small spaces of prestige and competition through domestic hosting. A pineapple party was a controlled display of wealth, taste, and colonial reach. It allowed a woman to show that her household was cultured, connected, and comfortably prosperous. There were, of course, quiet critics. A few religious pamphlets from the era mention the fruitful vanities of gentlewomen, warning that the obsession with unnatural fruit was a distraction from proper Christian humility. Others viewed the events with amusement, if not outright condescension. In 1824, an anonymous letter published in the Morning Chronicle mocked the practice. If only our noble ladies could be persuaded to throw such admiration at their husbands as they do at a tart fruit from Jamaica, what a harmonious kingdom we might yet become. Still, the pineapple's reign continued. It even made its way into portraiture. Several wealthy families commissioned oil paintings that included a pineapple, sometimes held in hand, other times sitting quietly on a side table as a subtle nod to their colonial success. These paintings, still hanging in some country houses today, are sometimes misidentified as still lifes. But for their subjects, they were as political and aspirational as a coat of arms. The fruit was quite literally a sign of empire. By the 1830s, there were even short-run periodicals and ladies' magazines that covered pineapple news. How to store them, how to tell a fake from the real thing, and what colors best complemented a pineapple's golden hue at a table setting. In one issue of the Ladies' Monthly Repository, a reader asked whether it was vulgar or refined to pair a pineapple centerpiece with shellfish. The editor advised against it. The sea and the tropic ought not to mingle in decorum. And yet, despite all the pageantry, despite the rentals, the parties, the sketches, the lectures, and the fake wax replicas, one question lingered in the minds of many first-time guests. What did a pineapple actually taste like? For many women of the time, the answer remained elusive. Tasting the fruit would mean destroying it, and so it remained in its glass cloche, perfectly untasted, impossibly desirable. By the 1840s, the pineapple had transformed from a coveted object of aristocratic whim into a more complex social symbol. The novelty of the fruit hadn't faded, but its context was changing. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping Britain. Middle-class ambitions were growing, and with faster shipping, new greenhouse technologies, and colonial expansion, pineapples were becoming just accessible enough to fuel a kind of consumer madness, what one newspaper called the tropical fever. It was during these decades that pineapple parties, once the quiet indulgence of the gentry, spread across the middle-class suburbs of England. As railway lines crisscrossed the countryside and newspapers reached homes in once remote towns, word of the pineapple craze traveled faster than the fruit itself. Hostesses in Leeds, Norwich, and even coastal towns like Scarborough began to replicate the now familiar ritual of pineapple display. What with the fruit slightly more obtainably and competition more fierce, these gatherings began to shift in tone. Now, it wasn't just enough to have a pineapple. You had to present the right kind of pineapple. Fruit traders seized this moment with entrepreneurial flair. By mid-century, London's Covent Garden Market had a handful of specialized vendors who sold pineapples not merely as produce but as lifestyle objects. Some shops displayed them on velvet cushions. Others offered tiered pricing, standard, ornamental, or presentation grade. These presentation grade pineapples were prized for their perfect symmetry, deep green leaves, and amber coloring. They were almost never eaten. Savvy hostess might send her butler or maid with a carefully written note requesting a well-rounded, note-not specimen with a noble profile and minimal splay. Pineapple catalogs, yes. Catalogs included watercolor illustrations and glowing prose, a triumphant fruit with the posture of a queen or skin like Florentine leather, crowned with verdant glory. The performative nature of these fruits reached new heights when manufacturers began producing pineapple display stands specifically for parlors. These were often carved from mahogany or oak, with ornate feet and gilded bowls lined with felt or satin. Pineapples were no longer perched on dinner tables, but raised like trophies in the center of drawing rooms, where visitors might admire them while sipping tea and discussing the Crimean War. And then came the keepsakes. You see the pineapples? Beauty was so ephemeral, just a few days of golden perfection before decay set in, that some ladies began commissioning portraits of their pineapples. It sounds absurd, but records from minor portrait artists show a rise in commissions between 1847 and 1852, titled simply Fruit Study or Still Life with Pine. Some included a handwritten dedication in memory of the April pineapple of Miss Lavinia Wells. May her 12 shillings be not in vain? In more affluent households, photographers were sometimes hired to capture the fruit's glory before it. Withered, the pineapple, flanked by curtains and family heirlooms, was photographed like a beloved pet. One London photographer even advertised carte de visite services for domestic tropicals. Behind this display culture, however, a quiet business engine was humming. Pineapple brokers and fruit traders operated a brisk market. It was risky. Pineapples spoiled quickly, and shipping from the Caribbean was unpredictable. Many fruits arrived rotten or bruised, but the demand was so high that traders found inventive ways to maximize profit, created a tiered rental system. A fresh specimen could fetch the highest rental price for 48 hours. After that, it dropped to moderate condition pricing. Once it began to soften, it was offered as table fruit, usually to hotels or gentlemen's clubs. In its final hours, it might be sold to a confectioner, where it would be pulped into jams or candied. In some towns, enterprising young men rented pineapples door to door. For a small fee, they would carry a polished fruit to your home, allow your guests to view it during a dinner, then whisk it away to the next appointment. Some pineapples might make the rounds for 5 or 6 households in a single evening, but with success came suspicion. Not all pineapple displays were what they seemed. Wax replicas, once a desperate substitute, were now being made with such precision that even experienced fruit dealers were occasionally fooled. A scandal broke in Manchester in 1854 when a prominent hostess hosted a pineapple supper complete with champagne and poetry, only for her rival to discover that the fruit had been fashioned from candle wax and turtle shell. The letter describing this betrayal made it into the Times, and for a brief period, guests began bringing sewing needles to parties to test the authenticity of the centerpiece. This tension between performance and reality was never resolved. If anything, it deepened. The pineapple craze became a kind of theater in which everyone played along, aware of the artifice, but unwilling to break the spell. Meanwhile, in the colonies, pineapples were harvested by the thousands under the scorching sun by underpaid laborers, mostly enslaved or indentured workers in Jamaica, Barbados, and later Hawaii. Their conditions were harsh, and their pith any minuscule. While British hostesses wrote whimsical verses about the noble crown of fruit, others toiled barefoot through sharp-leafed fields, cutting and hauling the fruit that would never be eaten by those who displayed it. There is very little mention of this in the pineapple party literature. A few progressive thinkers raised concerns about the labor conditions of tropical produce, but these were often brushed aside. in one issue of the Gentleman's Review, a column titled "Tropical Elegance in Its Duties," gently encouraged readers to remember that our fruit's journey is not one of leisure but quickly moved on to discuss pineapple-infused sponge cakes. It's worth noting, too, that pineapple parties began to take on competitive overtones. In some towns, local newspapers began reporting on them. The Bath Courier listed the best-dressed pineapple of the season in 1858. A Miss Julia won best arrangement for her fruit, which she had surrounded with mirrors and tiny oil lamps to enhance its luster. Social rivalry reached its zenith when entire parties were themed around pineapple mockery. In Brighton, a group of unmarried women hosted what they called a pineapple protest, where guests were invited to wear fruit-themed hats and write satirical odes to fruit-related vanity. It was ironically one of the most fashionable events of that season. Still, through all this performance, a curious fact remained. Very few partygoers had ever tasted one. The act of cutting open a pineapple at a gathering was considered a deeply emotional decision. It suggested that the hostess was either extremely rich or possibly desperate to impress. It also meant that the moment of admiration had passed, and now the fruit would enter its lesser mortal stage, digestion. But once in a while, a hostess would dare. One story shared in a gardening diary from Devonshire describes such an event in 1862. The hostess, a widow of modest means, had managed to grow her own pineapple after 3 years of careful tending in a coal-heated pit. She invited 7 close friends, brought out her grandmother's silver cutlery, and after a prayer sliced the fruit in half. Guests reportedly wept. They described the taste as sunlight caught in syrup, tropical snow, and the gentlest bite of God's warmth. Whether the fruit was truly that good, or whether the moment had been so built up over years of longing, is hard to say. But for those women, it was unforgettable. And so the pineapple, despite its absurdity, had become more than an ornament. It was an emotional artifact, a fruit that embodied longing, status, distance, and control. But by the 1870s, change was on the horizon. Shipping routes were improving, canning technology was advancing, and a new kind of pineapple, the tinned pineapple, was about to transform the fruit from a luxury to a shelf item. It raised a question that would quietly worry many hostesses. What happens when everyone can afford a pineapple? By the closing decades of the 19th century, the pineapple had lost some of its mystery. It still held a whiff of colonial exoticism and a trace of social status. But the deep reverence, the kind that once compelled women to sketch its silhouette in silence, was fading. The reason was simple. The pineapple had become available. Steamships and refrigerated cargo had revolutionized the global fruit trade. What once took weeks to ship could now arrive in days, better preserved and in greater quantities. A fruit that had once passed between elite households like a sacred relic was now being sold by weight in ordinary grocers the first time. Even middle-class families in provincial towns could buy one not to display but to eat. Or still to the upper crust, you didn't even need the whole fruit anymore. Canned pineapples, sliced syrupy, stacked in metal, tins began appearing on British shelves in the early 1870s. Imported mainly from Hawaii and the Philippines, these preserved versions of the once prized delicacy were now being sold under brand names like Libby's and Dole. It was the democratization of the exotic, and it created an identity crisis for the pineapple party. Hostesses, once proud to arrange entire evenings around a fruit, now found themselves wondering if it was still appropriate to do so. If pineapples could be purchased at the corner shop for 6 pence, was it still elegant to display one in a cut-glass cloche? Did it make you look fashionable, or simply out of touch? Magazines of the period reflect this shift in tone. The Lady's Companion in 1874 published a brief, almost mournful note under its household pleasures section, though the pineapple remains a pleasing table fruit. Its presence no longer speaks of fortune or connection. As with all symbols, time devours their mystery. Still, some hostesses refused to let go. There were attempts to evolve the tradition to make the pineapple party more than just a fruit viewing. One notable effort came from a woman named Miss Dorothea Hargreaves of York, who in 1878 held what she described as a tropical lecture salon. Her guests were treated not only to pineapple slices served with toothpicks made of mother-of-pearl, but also to a short lecture on the botany of bromeliads and the economics of Jamaican fruit export. The evening concluded with a poem composed for the occasion, the crown of the colonies. Other households followed suit. Pineapple-themed poetry readings, musical recitals, and even light theatrical skits, usually involving a fruit king or Lady Panoplia, became part of these desperate final flourishes of an era. They were elaborate and charming, but everyone sensed it. The fruit was no longer the point. The pineapple had slipped from being a symbol of global reach and domestic elegance to being ingredient. Cookbooks from the 1880s illustrate this shift. No longer confined to centerpieces, pineapple began to appear in recipes for jellies, ice creams, puddings, and decorative molds. Cake, in its earliest protoforms, began appearing in American-influenced domestic guides. Pineapple chutney was experimented with by Anglo-Indian households. These were not trivial changes. They marked a cultural transition from admiration to consumption. The fruit was no longer something to orbit in reverence. It was something to use. The pineapple had entered the kitchen. The fall of the pineapple's status also coincided with other shifts in women's roles. The final decades of the Victorian period were marked by a slow, uneven transformation of gender expectations. Women were beginning to publish, to organize, and to speak more openly about rights, education, and the limits of domestic life. In this context, the idea of devoting an entire evening to the appreciation of a tropical fruit began to feel outdated and embarrassing. The pineapple party came to represent, for some, kind of ornamental womanhood and image of a domestic sphere where creativity was limited to tablescapes and dessert displays. Satirists in the 1890s began to lampoon it openly. In One Punch, cartoon from 1893. A drawing shows a woman in full formal wear, bowing before a pineapple on a stool, while her husband sneaks away to the pub. Still, not everyone was ready to abandon the ritual. Some held on to it as a form of nostalgia owed to a more elegant age. Few older ladies, especially those in rural estates, untouched by rapid urbanization, continued to host seasonal pineapple evenings, inviting guests to admire, not eat a hand-grown fruit from their personal glasshouse. These last events had a curiously melancholic air about them. Accounts describe lace doilies, chamber music, and conversations about how things used to be. The fruit, once a spark of future-facing exoticism, was now a relic, no longer rare, but still symbolic. And so the pineapple's second life began no longer a luxury object. The pineapple became a motif. You started seeing it not in parlor rooms, but in printed advertisements, wallpapers, and holiday postcards. Hotels, especially those near seaside resorts, began using pineapples in their logos, tapping into the fruit's long-standing association with hospitality. Colonial outposts used it in official seals and symbols. Most ironically, some buildings erected pineapple statues. The Dunmore pineapple, built in Scotland decades earlier in 1761, is now being recognized not as an architectural folly, but as a kind of monument to British horticultural pride. Tourists would take photographs beside its giant stone fruit, unaware of the decades of whispering, admiration, competition, and jealousy it once inspired. By the dawn of the 20th century, no one hosted pineapple parties anymore. The fruit was now part of ordinary British life. Tinned pineapple slices were served on gammon steaks in pubs. Children were given pineapple candies. Pineapple flavor appeared in teas, cordials, and vinegar sauces. You could eat it without renting it, posing with it, or writing a poem about it. And yet, in a few dusty journals and in the yellowing letters preserved in drawers, you can still find the outlines of a world in which this odd tropical fruit was a social beacon, where its leathery skin and sharp crown represented power, connection, and domestic grace. You can still visit the estates with long-forgotten pineries. Many have collapsed into moss and glass shards, overtaken by ivy and years. But if you find a very old British country house and ask the caretaker to show you the old hothouses, they might lead you to a sagging corner of the garden. And if you're lucky, there might still be hanging from the roof by rusted iron hooks, a single pineapple-shaped lantern, or the scorched remains of a coal-fired pit. There, among cracked bricks and overgrown vines, you might imagine what it was like to wait 3 years for a single fruit, only to never eat it. And in that space between absurdity and reverence, you might begin to understand what the pineapple party truly represented: the human urge to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, to turn even fruit into theater, and to define meaning, however fleeting, in a world rapidly spinning forward. Because history isn't always made by wars or kings. Sometimes it's made by women in tea gowns, whispering admiration over a rented pineapple, their gloved fingers hovering just above the spines. You likely wouldn't think of a baker as someone living on the edge of criminality. And yet, in medieval Europe, especially in towns across England, bakers walked a tightrope between survival and severe punishment. At the heart of this quiet tension was a simple product: the humble loaf of bread. In a time before industrial food production, bread was everything. It was the staple food for the poor, the default ration for laborers, and a point of pride for guilds. Bread kept bellies full and economies stable. But it was also volatile. Wheat prices fluctuated wildly with the seasons, and milling techniques varied in quality. To cheat on the weight or quality of a loaf, whether intentionally or not, could lead to ruin not just of business but of body. At the core of this system was a law known as the assize of bread. First formalized in England in 1266 under King Henry III, and based on earlier statutes, this document regulated the price, weight, and even content of loaves across the kingdom. The idea was simple: ensure that bakers adjusted the size of their loaves to match fluctuations in the price of grain, so that customers were not cheated during times of scarcity. This meant that bread prices did not change. Instead, the weight of the bread changed. If grain was plentiful and cheap, a penny bought you a large, heavy loaf. If grain was scarce and expensive, the same penny earned you a small, sad lump of barely risen dough. Bakers had to recalculate the weight of their loaves almost weekly, sometimes daily, based on the official grain price set by the town authorities. And here's where things became dangerous. If a baker miscalculated or worse, tried to skimp on flour and pocket the difference, they could be fined. It's publicly shamed, thrown in the stocks, or even on rare occasions dragged through the streets on a sled with loaves tied around their necks. In 14th century London, this practice became ritualized. The offending baker would be paraded through the market square while a crier announced their offense. Lo, this man hath defrauded the people of their daily bread. The punishment was meant to humiliate, not just penalize. It turned the baker into a public lesson. And in a society where most people lived on the edge of hunger, this humiliation was deadly serious. For many bakers, the only way to avoid such punishment was to build in a safety net. This led to one of the more peculiar practices in medieval commerce: the baker's dozen. That familiar phrase meaning 13 instead of 12 wasn't an act of generosity. It was a form of insurance. Bakers would often include a 13th loaf or a small extra roll, with every dozen sold to ensure that their customers received full weight. This inbred bonus helped protect them from accusations of shortchanging, especially from finicky or vindictive officials who carried small portable scales and weren't above extorting bribes in exchange for looking the other way. Some bakers even added a 14th roll for good measures, especially when supplying 2 monasteries or the homes of wealthy lords. Better to give away a little extra than to risk being shackled for fraud. Of course, not all bakers were innocent. The temptations were real. In lean times, when flour was expensive and customers had few options, some bakers would stretch dough with less than savory fillers. Bran, ground peas, beans, and even powdered chalk or mashed roots found their way into lower quality loaves. These adulterated breads were known by many names: horse bread, bastard bread, or the more damning cheap bread. Horse bread, in particular, was exactly what it sounded like: bread intended for animals, made of the cheapest ingredients. But during famines, it was often eaten by the poor, and unscrupulous bakers would disguise it as better fare by brushing it with oil or shaping it into familiar forms. Naturally, guilds and watchmen were on alert for such deceptions. In towns with active baking guilds, the master baker might perform surprise inspections. Tools of the trade included weights, balances, scoops, and knives used to cut through loaves and inspect texture and ingredients. Any irregularity, a hollow center, an off smell, suspicious flex, could trigger a fine. The penalties were standardized. First offense, a fine. Second offense, stocks or pillory. Third offense, public dragging. Fourth offense, expulsion from the guild, which was tantamount to economic death. In some towns, repeat fraud could be escalated to criminal charges, and in wartime or famine, harsh punishments were delivered swiftly. Yet the baker's life was not all shadows and fear. They held a curious position in society, though often regarded with suspiciousness, especially when bread was scarce. They were essential. No other profession touched so many lives so regularly. Even blacksmiths and coopers could afford to take a day off. Bakers couldn't. Their work began at 2 or 3 in the morning, often in cold stone ovens, and involved long hours of kneading, stoking, waiting, and shaping. The rhythm of medieval cities often began with the smell of rising bread. Streets would carry the scent of yeast and flour long before the sun rose. Children ran errands with cloth-wrapped loaves. Churches received their daily tithes in bread. Soldiers were provisioned with dense rolls called trenchers, meant to double as both. Food and plate, even the dead on occasion, were commemorated with funeral loaves, blessed by priests and handed to the poor. Because of their importance, bakers often found themselves caught between compassion and commerce. In times of famine, towns might compel bakers to produce loaves at a loss to keep the poor from rioting. These alms loaves were usually coarse and thin, but still better than nothing. In return, bakers were sometimes compensated later through tax relief or grain allotments, but not always. This delicate balance of survival and service played out daily in towns across Europe. A well-respected baker might be viewed with affection a provider, a steward of public welfare. A dishonest one could be treated as a traitor. To the people's hunger? Outside of cities, village bakers faced a different kind of challenge, with fewer regulations and no official weights to measure against. Local bakers had more freedom, but also more responsibility. It was here that relationships mattered most. A village baker who gained the trust of her neighbors, yes, many bakers, where women might enjoy steady business and informal protection. But even a single incident of dishonesty could lead to being ostracized, or worse, rumors of poisoning or demonic meddling weren't uncommon, especially when illness followed the eating of suspicious bread. It's easy to forget just how central bread was to the medieval world. Unlike today, where bread is often an accessory or a side dish, it was once the main dish every meal, every day for most people. Porridge, stew, and ale might supplement the diet, but bread was the foundation. And when the foundation cracked, when the loaf was light, spoiled, or falsely advertised, the anger it sparked could erupt quickly. In 1315, during one of the worst pan-European famines in centuries, bread riots erupted in multiple towns. Bakers' shops were stormed, or ovens were smashed. Several bakers were hanged without trial, accused of hoarding flour or mixing false ingredients. The authorities, desperate to maintain order, began issuing more aggressive proclamations and tighter controls on grain markets. Some towns introduced public baking halls, where bread was made under the watch of officials and then distributed through fixed-price systems. These proto-socialist experiments rarely lasted, but they show how deeply the politics of bread shaped medieval urban planning and justice. All of this raises a question we rarely consider when passing the bread aisle. In a supermarket, how did something so ordinary become so dangerous? Was it the fragility of a society where food scarcity was always one bad harvest away? Was it the human instinct to police fairness in everyday exchange? Or was it something deeper, shared understanding that the line between civilization and collapse could, in fact, be measured by the weight of a single loaf? As the Middle Ages wore on and legal codes evolved, the life of the baker remained tense but essential. Guilds became more organized. Some towns began allowing bakers to post guarantee marks or branded initials on their loaves. These served as early forms of consumer protection, a signature of accountability. But the fear never truly left. One bad batch, one mistaken weight, one panicked shortcut with old flour, and a baker could find themselves not just fined, but displayed, mocked, and remembered in shame. It makes you wonder, what would you do if your job involved the constant risk of public humiliation over a few missing ounces of flour? It's easy to overlook the Guildhall, the bustling towns of late medieval Europe it might have stood. Near the market square, sturdy, functional, rarely grand. But for the baker, it was more than a building. It was a sanctuary, a regulator, a courtroom, and a shield. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as cities expanded and trade increased, bakers increasingly organized themselves into guilds, formal associations that governed the training, quality, ethics, and economic rules of a profession. These were more than unions. They were essential institutions in urban life, tasked with upholding both commercial integrity and civic harmony. And in no profession was this taken more seriously than in baking. To become a guild baker, one did not simply decide to start baking bread. The process often began in youth, usually as an apprentice, bound by contract to a master baker for 7 years or more. The apprentice lived in the master's home, worked long hours, and learned the trade from the bottom up: how to choose grain, clean a millstone, feed a fire, knead dough with consistent pressure, time fermentation without a clock, and judge oven temperatures by scent and the color of bricks. No detail was considered too small. Apprentices learned how to weigh ingredients using hand-forged scales, how to recognize moldy flour by texture, and how to stretch a batch without compromising its weight. They were expected to know not just recipes, but the mood of breadites: hiss, its crust, its resistance beneath the palm. To bake well wasn't just a skill, it was a kind of sensory devotion. After years of labor, the apprentice might become a journeyman, allowed to bake for pay, but still under the oversight of the guild. Only after passing rigorous inspections, often including the creation of several test loaves under supervision, could one hope to attain the title of master baker and operate a bakery independently. Even then, guild life wasn't easy. Meetings were mandatory. Dues were paid regularly, partly to fund communal ovens, funerals, and the care of sick or elderly members. Guild officers could conduct unannounced inspections and impose fines or suspensions. Members who violated the rules, underweight loaves, filthy bakehouses, dishonest sales, were punished swiftly. One of the more curious aspects of guild regulation was the communal oven. In many towns, especially smaller ones or places with limited fuel, the guild maintained a large centralized oven where bakers would bring their dough to be baked. Time slots were strict. Bakers were expected to arrive promptly, prepare quickly, and remove their loaves when the oven master rang. A small bell. Disputes over timing could become heated, especially if a delay ruined someone's batch. In some towns, non-guild members like housewives or rural peasants could pay to use the communal oven, though they were given less desirable times, often late at night. In such cases, a guild official might mark their loaves with notches or bread stamps to ensure no theft or confusion. These markings are among the earliest examples of regulated food branding. The oven itself was no small matter. Constructed of thick brick or stone, usually dome-shaped, it had to be heated hours in advance, with bundles of faggots or peat. Once the interior reached the desired heat, the fuel was raked out, and the radiant warmth of the stones would bake the bread in batches. A good oven, properly fired, could retain heat for hours and bake hundreds of loaves. But mistime the firing or overload the chamber and the bread could burn, underbake, or come out with soggy bottoms. Guilds often had strict rules about oven maintenance, with assigned firekeepers and fines for negligence. The oven was sacred in its own way. It symbolized order, fairness, and the mysterious transformation of raw dough into sustenance. But guilds weren't just about rules and recipes. They were also deeply involved in public life. On feast days and holidays, bakers might sponsor processions, distribute free bread to the poor, or fund church candles. In cities like Bruges, York, and Cologne, bakers marched in ceremonial robes, usually brown or white linen, with symbols of their crafts stitched onto their sleeves: a paddle, a loaf, and a wheat sheaf. They held patron saints close, St honor in France and St. Clement in parts of England. These figures were invoked in prayers before risky bakes or during poor harvests. Guild halls sometimes had shrines or small chapels where bakers lit candles before sunrise shifts, asking for strong flour, safe ovens, and fair weights. Still, despite the structure and pride of guild life, bakers remained vulnerable. A single crop failure could throw an entire city into chaos. Wheat was fragile, susceptible to cold, mold, and rot. When grain supplies tightened, so did tempers. It was always the baker, not the miller, not the farmer, who bore the brunt of that fury. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, entire towns in northern Europe saw bread prices double, then triple, lined up for hours outside bakehouses. Guilds pleaded with city councils to fix grain prices or release emergency stores. Some places, they were ignored. In others, bakers were told to produce justice bread, a basic loaf sold at a loss, subsidized only in theory. Riots followed. In Ghent, a bakehouse was torched. In York, 2 bakers were hanged for alleged hoarding, though no formal trial was held. Even in calmer times, whispers of corruption could travel fast. A baker who was rumored to add ash, sawdust, or stone dust to flour could lose all customers overnight. Whether or not the accusation was true mattered little. Bread was trust. And once that trust was broken, the damage was difficult to undo. Some bakers leaned heavily on ritual to reassure clients. A small cross might be cut into the top of each loaf before baking, not just for flavor or venting steam, but as a visible sign of piety. Others displayed saints' medals in their shop windows. Still others printed guild seals on waxed parchment. Wrapped around batches for wealthy patrons, bakers also had to navigate the legal realm.
Ow.
Cities, guilds, often kept detailed bread registers, recording the daily grain price, the corresponding loaf weight, and any incidents of complaint or fine. These records were stored in wooden chests and brought to city councils if disputes arose. A baker accused of underweight loaves could request a formal review, presenting the register and appealing for leniency. Sometimes they won, sometimes they didn't. There's a recorded case from Coventry in 1441, where a widow baker named Agnes Rolfe was fined 3 times in one season for loaves, found too meager by a margin of 2 ounces. On the 4th offense, she was sentenced to a day in the public pillory, her loaves hung around her neck with twine. She survived the punishment and returned to her shop only to find her stall boy had joined a brewer's guild instead. Agnes disappears from the records soon after. Bread remained central to social tension. On fast days, during Lent or Fridays, when meat was forbidden, bakers saw higher sales but also greater scrutiny. Loaves had to be pure, free of fat or milk. Church officials might inspect the kneading troughs. Rumors that a baker had violated fasting laws could lead to clerical censure or excommunication. But bakers also had power. The ability to withhold bread even briefly gave them subtle leverage. If a city council delayed payments for justice loaves, a guild might stage a brief work stoppage. Not a full strike unthinkable in the medieval hierarchy, but a pause. Fires banked slower. Flour was measured more carefully. Delivery boys sent out late. The message was quiet but clear. Respect the loaf. And more than once, that message worked. All this speaks to a deeper truth about medieval life, that the most mundane items, the things we now pass without thought, once held immense symbolic and practical power. In a society without refrigerators, supermarkets, or industrial mills, every bite of bread was hard-won, passed through fields, weather, harvest, grinding stones, kneading hands, flickering ovens, and dozens of daily judgments. And the baker, half artisan, half scapegoats, stood at the center of it all. Their stories rarely made the chronicles. No epic poem was written about flour weights or baking stones. But if you read between the lines of court records, guild rolls, and church accounts, you find them. Men and women rising before dawn, calculating ratios by lantern light, dodging suspicion, feeding a city one loaf at a time. And as the centuries turned and ovens evolved, one question never quite disappeared. How much weight can one loaf of bread truly carry? There is a quiet drama to watching bread cool. Steam rises, crusts crackle softly. The loaf, still puffed from the oven's memory, begins to settle into itself. In this moment, brief and nearly silent, a baker could reflect on whether they had succeeded or failed. By the early 1500s, the world around the baker was changing, but the risks remained, hauntingly familiar. The medieval system of baking regulation, with its pillories, punishment, and protective guilds, had begun to show signs of strain. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the slow rise of modern statehood altered the way power flowed on with it, the ways bakers were watched, trusted, or punished. But bread still mattered, and bread fraud still carried the possibility of exile, ruin, or worse. The rise of bureaucratic oversight, the later Middle Ages, gave way to more centralized forms of control. In places like Tudor England or post-Hanseatic German states, municipal oversight over baking became more formalized. What had once been managed by guild elders in small towns was now being shaped by city inspectors, royal agents, and council clerks with long scrolls and measuring rods. By 1552 in London, for example, the city's assize of bread and ale was enforced with an almost obsessive regularity. Inspectors roamed the streets, surprise visiting bakehouses to weigh loaves and verify prices. Bakers were now held accountable, not only to their guilds, but also to the growing arm of the crown. In theory, this shift should have helped bakers, especially honest ones. But in practice, it meant they were constantly navigating multiple layers of scrutiny. Guildmasters might inspect the texture of a crust, while royal agents demanded exact weights down to a dram. A baker might be deemed faithful by local peers, but still fined by a magistrate for violating a law printed in a ledger he'd never read. And while some towns had lenient traditions, others enforced penalties with frightening vigor. One baker in Augsburg, fined for underselling rye bread, was made to wear a wooden yoke studded with burnt crusts as he was paraded through the city streets. In Bruges, a baker accused of diluting dough with barley husk was publicly whipped, and forced to build a new brick oven for the town square. There was something nearly theological about the inspection of loaves. The baker's sin wasn't just dishonesty, it was imbalance, a moral failing embodied in the weight and form of something sacred. The practical realities of fraud, despite the risk, some bakers did cheat. Why? Because survival in a pre-industrial economy was never easy. Fires could fail. Flour could mold. A single mistake dough that rose too fast, or an apprentice who miscounted, could mean lost income. A sick child, a tax collector's visit, or a dry month could tempt even good bakers to try and stretch a batch. The most common trick was still the old one, underweight loaves, but others became more sophisticated. Some bakers soaked their flour with extra water just before kneading, letting it absorb without immediately altering the dough's feel. Others padded loaves with dried root fiber or old breadcrumbs. Few mixed grains from different sacks to obscure poor quality. More subtle forms of deception crept in too. Loaves were shaped unusually to confuse inspectors or dusted heavily, with flour to disguise surface cracks. A darker bake could hide a lack of rise. In cities with multiple ethnic or religious groups like Antwerp, Venice, or Constantinople, some bakers falsely labeled breads to avoid taxes or to sneak goods. Passed fasting laws. Authorities fought back in kind. In London and Paris, some inspectors carried custom-made balances designed to weigh loaves instantly. Others tested loaves by cutting them apart and sniffing the crumb, looking for signs of dampness or over-souring. In one bizarre case from Lyon, an inspector reportedly licked the heel of a loaf to confirm it had been baked recently. And for all this effort, still, mistakes were made. One record from a Dutch town notes that an entire family of bakers was wrongly accused when a batch of spoiled flour was sold under the table by a dishonest miller. By the time the truth came out, the bakers had already lost their shop and been exiled to the edge of town. Bread was power, but also risk, and the smallest fault could tip the scales. Bread riots and the power of the crowd, nowhere was this risk more visible than in moments of scarcity. Bread, riots, sporadic, spontaneous, and deeply emotional, became common across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. sometimes triggered by poor harvests, sometimes by taxation or foreign wars. These riots focused their fury almost exclusively on bakeries. In Naples in 1585, women armed with brooms and hot coals stormed the bakeries near the port, demanding fixed prices and accusing bakers of hiding flour. In Rouen, an entire row of bakehouses was looted during a 3-day riot sparked by rumors of hollow loaves. These were not professional revolutions. They were acts of desperation by people who saw their children grow thin and their wages lose value. Bread wasn't just food, it was a symbol of survival. And when it failed them, they turned on those closest to the oven. Bakers learned to prepare. Many shops built iron grates over their windows, installed escape doors, or kept decoy sacks of flour in case of theft. A few employed armed guards. Others tried to placate crowds with small handouts, free rolls to children, leftovers given to the church. Yet even these precautions failed sometimes. A baker who tried to reason with an angry crowd was dragged to the town square, forced to eat 6 loaves one after another, then pelted with stale rye until he collapsed. The mayor later ruled the punishment excessive, but understandable. Even in smaller towns, a baker could go from trusted tradesman to despised figure in a single day. The baker's life at home away from the public eye. The baker's home was an extension of the bakehouse, often attached to it, or even occupying the upper floors. The oven's heat rose through the walls, warming sleeping quarters in winter. The scent of yeast clung to curtains and bed linen. Ash dust settled in the corners of books and beneath wooden toys. Baking was often a family affair. Wives kneaded dough or wrapped loaves. Older children carried messages to millers or helped stir porridges used for starters. Infants were rocked in baskets beside barrels of flour. In some records, midwives described delivering babies near the fire while bread was rising. Closeness made the line between work and life indistinct. If the dough failed, if the flour ran short, if a customer accused them, everyone felt it. Families lived at the edge of respectability. A good week meant candles and meat. A bad week meant thinner broth and silent dinners. But many bakers found comfort in the rhythm of the bake. Waking before dawn, heating the oven, feeling the dough yield, listening for that exact moment when crusts crackled in response to the cooler air. Baking offered a kind of temporal stability in a chaotic world. The calendar could change. The politics could shift. But the loaf still rose if you treated it right. The end of the bread scales. By the late 1600s, technology and trade began to reshape the entire bread economy. New milling techniques improved flour consistency. Improved roads meant more regular grain shipments. Cities introduced official bread carts and sealed weights to enforce standards. The rise of newspapers brought new forms of public accountability. Bakers who were fined or caught cheating might find their names printed shamed in print rather than pilloried in the street. Some called this progress. Others missed the old days. One London baker, writing in a letter from 1693, lamented, "Now it is not enough to bake fair and true. We must answer to men with ink and spectacles who have never shaped a loaf. They speak of measures and systems, but know not hunger." The personal pride of the baker once, measured by a firm crust, a golden hue, or the gratitude of neighbors, was being subsumed into paperwork and bureaucracy. Regulation had not vanished, but transformed. It was less violent, more technical, and no less relentless. Still, the baker remained, wary, flour-dusted, watching the sky for signs of drought, counting sacks, waking early, holding in their hands the age-old question, was this loaf good enough not just to eat, but to trust? Reflections at the oven's edge in our modern world. Bread has changed. It's sliced, sealed, and processed. It arrives in plastic bags, uniform and impersonal. Yet even now, the shape of a loaf carries deep meaning in many cultures. And in places where bread is still made by hand, the echoes of the medieval baker remain. The fear of fraud, the need for balance, the quiet pride in feeding others. Today, you can buy a loaf with a barcode. But centuries ago, you would have looked your baker in the eye, trusted their hands, judged their honesty by the heft of the loaf, and the scent in the air. And if it was too light, too soft to suspicious you, might have wondered what else is missing in this world we're told to trust. It is difficult to imagine now, but once upon a time in Britain, the sight of a pineapple was enough to stop conversations, attract crowds, and make noblemen clutch their hearts in wonder. In the damp, gray mornings of 17th century England where boiled root vegetables and jellied meats reigned supreme, the pineapple was a scandal of color and perfume. Its golden skin, sharp-crowned top, and honeyed fragrance had the air of a relic from Eden. You did not eat a pineapple. You admired it. You discussed it. You loaned it out for parties. And if you were particularly fortunate, you might hold one briefly before it rotted into mush. This is the story of how an absurd tropical fruit became the ultimate status symbol in Georgian and Victorian Britain, and how its bizarre social orbit led to some of the quietest, most reverent dinner parties in history. The first pineapples. In England, the earliest known pineapple to reach English shores did not come as cargo. It came as a diplomatic curiosity. Records from the 1660s suggest that the first fruit arrived via the Caribbean colonies. It's presented as a gift to King Charles II. One account describes the royal gardener John Rose handing the king a single fruit, freshly grown in a private hothouse, a feat that became so legendary it was later immortalized in a painting. But even before it could be grown in England, the pineapple was known in whispers among merchants, sailors, and poets, who spoke of a fruit that bit like fire, yet sweet as God's breath. These early pineapples, often half-rotten by the time they arrived from Jamaica or Barbados, were not for eating. They were for seeing. By the 1680s, the nobility had begun importing pineapples purely as table ornaments. They were placed atop elaborate centerpieces, surrounded by candied citrus and peeled grapes, meant to astonish guests who had only read of such fruits in travel accounts or religious allegories. To have a pineapple was to say, without saying, I have ships, I have colonies, I can afford to waste this fruit. Pineapple rentals and portraits. The pineapple boom was not driven by gluttony, but by prestige economics, since actual pineapples remained rare and extremely expensive sometimes, costing the equivalent of a tradesman's annual wages. Enterprising vendors began to rent them out. A single pineapple might appear at 3 or 4 separate dinners in a week, passed carefully between households like a theatrical prop. In London, pineapple rental services advertised their fruits in broadsheets. Find Jamaica fruits for hire by the day, whole or sliced for viewing, no tasting without bond. Households would borrow a pineapple, set it prominently on a silver dish during a soiree, and return it the next morning, hopefully, before it began to wilt or soften. Some guests, suspecting deception, would give the fruit a small, discreet squeeze while no one was looking. Others simply nodded in solemn awe. The visual presence of the pineapple became so potent that it began to appear in portraits, often perched near the sitter. In one famous painting from 1720, a viscountess gently rests her hand atop a pineapple with the same reverence one might show to a family heirloom or religious relic. To display a pineapple in this way wasn't indulgent. It was moral performance. It said, I know what is exotic. I have command of the world. I possess refinement and control, even if, in truth, the fruit was already fermenting from the inside. Growing them at home, the pineapple pit craze around the early 1700s, a few wealthy British landowners decided they would no longer be content merely borrowing pineapples. They wanted to grow their own. Thus began one of the quietest and most eccentric horticultural revolutions in Georgian Britain, the pineapple pit. Unlike native British crops, pineapples needed tropical heat and long growing periods, often 18 months or more. To achieve this in an English climate, gardeners built elaborate hothouses with angled glass, underground heating trenches filled with rotting manure, and careful water channels to mimic Caribbean humidity. Some pits required 3 gardeners to maintain one for heating, one for misting, and one for pest control. Yet a single successful pineapple could justify it all. Manuals were published with painstaking detail concerning the turn of the leaf after month 9, or observations. Upon the mold of the Dutch pit, as compared to the Norfolk, gentlemen exchanged letters with pineapple sketches, debating whether to expose the crown for extra sun or tuck it in against English frost. The first homegrown pineapple, reportedly cultivated in Chelsea in 1715, caused a stir in both botanical and aristocratic circles. It was displayed on a velvet cushion before it was ever sliced, and even then many still refused to eat it. By the late 18th century, the pineapple had fully entrenched itself in British upper-class society, not as food, but as a language. It spoke without saying anything. In a world where wealth and subtle social signaling ruled the drawing room, pineapples became tokens in a silent contest, pused to impress guests, attract suitors, or win quiet nods of approval from rival hostesses. And so, out of glass hothouses, art galleries, and hired fruitmen came something truly peculiar: the pineapple party.
Oh, what exactly was a pineapple party?
A pineapple party, like so many things in the upper reaches of 18th and early 19th century British society, was a performance. It wasn't about celebrating the fruit's taste. Most people had never even tried one. It was about creating a tableau, a miniature theater of taste and worldliness, centered on the mere presence of the pineapple. Invitations to such gatherings were sometimes written in verse or riddle form, alluding to the fruit without naming it outright. "Come sup with us 'neath golden crown, where sweetness lies, but won't be found. Not tasted, not touched, but dearly prized, the guest of honors not disguised." Upon arrival, guests were ushered into a parlor, often dimly lit with candlelight, and surrounded by arrangements of other fruits or flowers. At the center, the pineapple, placed atop silver trays, nestled among starched napkins or embroidered linen, it was positioned for maximum dramatic effect. The host might give a short speech, drawing comparisons between the pineapple and virtues like grace, foreign conquest, or moral strength. But the fruit itself, it was rarely eaten. Social games and etiquette, the fruit as judge at some pineapple.
Parties, particularly those hosted by young women of means, the fruit was used as a kind of silent judge in courtship.
Gentlemen suitors were seated strategically in the room and asked to compose odes, riddles, or miniature fables inspired by the pineapple. One might compare the fruit's outer thorns to the challenges of love, or its sweetness to virtue hidden beneath difficulty. These were recited aloud, sometimes with musical accompaniment. The pineapple didn't respond, of course, but the hostess did, and her approval or subtle dismissal marked by something as small as a raised eyebrow or a whispered comment to a chaperone could shape the entire trajectory of a gentleman's hopes. In more raucous company, especially among the slightly less proper, there were even games of pineapple dare. Guests would be asked to pretend to eat the pineapple and describe the taste without ever having tried one. Points were awarded for poetic imagery or convincing lies. One documented occasion in 1799 describes a man who wept openly after being allowed to lick the outside of a pineapple rind. It was unclear whether he was being sincere or satirical. The fruit, meanwhile, remained untouched. The semi-tin pineapple, a problem of appearances eventually. Someone would cave. Maybe after several weeks of display, when the crown began to wilt and the base softened with fermentation. Someone would take a knife to the pineapple. But even this act carried layers of protocol. The first slice was often performed in silence. No one wished to be seen eager, nor to reveal ignorance about how to cut such an exotic thing. There was even a short-lived fashion for half-eaten pineapples displaying the fruit after a single slice had been removed, to give the appearance that one was both wealthy enough to own one and casual enough to eat from it. In reality, the slice was often placed beside the whole fruit again, uneaten, like a decorative decoy. Sometimes pineapples were sliced, dried, reassembled with pins and toothpicks to extend their visual usefulness across multiple social events. Diaries from certain hostesses refer to a specific fruit as "my February pineapple" or "Lady Delia's Lenten guest," indicating the fruit's long career as a party prop. And yes, there were still pineapple rental companies operating well into the 1820s. The more impressive fruits were treated like fine china or precious books, carefully logged, inventoried, and insured. The taste finally emerges at some point. Of course, the pineapple had to be eaten, and that's where the great reckoning occurred. Because despite all the anticipation, many Britons didn't like the taste. For a palate raised on boiled beef, bread pudding, and spiced port, The pineapple's intensity was overwhelming. Descriptions range from a violent sweetness to too sharp for the tongue, yet oddly cold. Some described it as a fruit that leaves you scalded and sour. One social commentator wrote, "The pineapple is best seen, less well smelt, and worst of all in the mouth. Like a portrait of heaven, it is admired from afar." Despite this, few would dare say so openly. Admitting disappointment in a pineapple, especially one grown by your host, was a breach of decorum. Instead, slices were often taken, not eaten, quietly slipped into a handkerchief or napkin, and discarded in the garden. Housekeepers began referring to pineapple heaps behind hedges the morning after parties. Still, a brave few did enjoy it. Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, reportedly acquired a taste for it and encouraged the royal kitchen to prepare pineapple in pies, jellies, and preserves. This, of course, only encouraged the social class beneath her to pretend to like it. More. Pineapple as architecture and decor, the fruit's real influence, however, may not have been culinary at all. It was architectural. As early as the 1770s, British estate owners began incorporating pineapple motifs into their buildings. The most famous example remains the Dunmore pineapple in Scotland, a literal 45-foot stone pineapple carved atop a garden folly, complete with arched windows and rococo detailing. Other appearances include pineapple-topped iron gate finials to show hospitality, pineapple-shaped bedposts in guest chambers embroidered, pineapple patterns in draperies or chairbacks, porcelain pineapples on mantels, sometimes with hidden compartments for sweets by the 1820s. To have a pineapple somewhere in the house, be it a carving, a fabric, or a fading fruit, was no longer about access to the colonies. It was about tradition, civility, and taste. The fruit had become a cultural ghost, echoing empire without the burden of actual flavor. By the time the Victorian era arrived in full force, the pineapple was no longer strange or untouchable. The world had changed, and so had British tastes. But before that happened, something strange occurred, something both ironic and oddly inevitable. Would you like to continue to Section 3? The democratization of pineapples and the decline of the fruit as a status symbol. As the 19th century pressed forward, the pineapple, once an elusive, fiercely protected guest of honor in Britain's most elite households, began its quiet descent. Not in popularity exactly, but in exclusivity. What was once a singular, unthinkably rare item became, gradually, a mere fruit. The pineapple had become accessible, and in doing so, it lost its power. The very thing that had made it precious scarcity was slipping away. Steamships, and the fall of the exotic, the first major change came with speed. By the 1830s, steamships and improved maritime routes allowed pineapples to be shipped directly from the Caribbean to Britain in a matter of weeks. Not months, weeks. This eliminated the need for the elaborate and expensive hothouse culture that had sustained the pineapple's mystique for nearly a century. For planters in Jamaica or Barbados, pineapples could now be packed in sawdust and shipped in crates somewhat bruised perhaps, but unmistakably fresh. By the 1840s, this became a reliable trade. London's Covent Garden Market, once home to one or two prized fruits on special auction days, could now display dozens at once. At first, the aristocracy responded by ignoring the newer foreign pineapples. Boat fruit, they called it, soft-fleshed, poorly ripened, and handled by dock workers rather than gardeners in embroidered gloves. But the economic pressure was undeniable. Why pay £60 for a hothouse-grown pineapple when you could obtain 3 or 4 for a tenth of that price? By 1850, pineapple theft was no longer a concern for landowners. The fruit simply wasn't worth stealing. Pineapple in the parlor. For everyone with the fruit no longer confined to the greenhouses of dukes and duchesses, it began appearing in more modest settings, the homes of merchants, bankers, and skilled professionals. What followed was a social diffusion. Victorian ladies who had once only seen pineapples in paintings or porcelain figurines could now purchase them, albeit slightly bruised, for tea parties or church luncheons. A fruit that once required a military garrison to guard was now passed, along with sponge cakes and lemon curd. New etiquette emerged. One no longer needed to invent poetry or riddles to praise the fruit. Instead, Recipe books offered practical advice. Pineapple to be stewed with sugar and clove. For a pudding, or served chilled with cream. The acid is strong and should be tempered. Cookbooks, such as Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, 1861 included pineapple among the many ingredients for middle-class entertaining, alongside blancmange, pickled walnuts, and calf's foot jelly. The fruit had gone from symbolic to edible, tinned and preserved. The final blow to prestige in 1892. The Hawaiian entrepreneur James Dole began the first large-scale pineapple canning operation. Though smaller efforts had existed for years, this innovation, however, had consequences even. Thousands of miles away in Britain, even the working class could enjoy pineapple at least in preserved form. Grocery stores began carrying tinned rings and syrup, which could be stored for months and used to flavor cakes, trifles, and puddings. No longer a silent token of empire or elegance, the pineapple became of all things a garnish. It topped gammon steaks. It sweetened upside-down cakes. It appeared in gelatin molds and railway buffet sandwiches. The fruit had been fully absorbed into the mass culture of convenience. Perhaps most damning of all, children now ate pineapple out of cans, with sticky fingers, without supervision. What had once required orchestras, oil lamps, and handwritten poems now sat beside pickles and treacle on corner shop shelves. It's the pineapple, as furniture, not fruit, but the memory of the pineapple's grandeur lingered. In fact, as its edibility increased, so did its appeal as decor. Architects, upholsterers, and furniture makers embraced the pineapple motif, not as a sign of rare taste, but as a nod to polite hospitality. By the 1880s and 1890s, British households of all classes might include a pineapple-shaped bedpost finial, candle holder curtain tasseled doorknob newel post topper. Hotels and guest houses often featured carved pineapples above their entrances, a stylized reminder that the guest would be welcomed with richness, even if only metaphorically. The fruit had become more of a shape than a flavor, a symbol of welcome, of outdated grandeur, safely repackaged for modern sensibilities. What happened to the pineapple parties? They disappeared, slowly and quietly. The elaborate rituals surrounding the fruit no longer made sense in an age of expanding colonial trade and middle-class consumption. By 1870, pineapple parties were mentioned mostly in memoirs or nostalgic social columns. I remember, as a child, being brought into the drawing room to see the pineapple. We were told not to speak loudly or point, and never to touch. It sat upon a velvet cushion like a sleeping dog. What had once been a center of social gravity now seemed faintly ridiculous, like powdered wigs or sedan chairs. In fact, some Victorian reformers mocked pineapple parties outright, calling them symbols of empty colonial vainglory or tropical affectation. The fruit had come to represent wastefulness, not wealth. The quiet echo of empire still, the story of the pineapple is more than just fruit. It's about how empires shape tastes, how distance breeds desire, and how scarcity, more than substance, defines what we value. The pineapple was never truly beloved for its flavor. It was loved for being hard to get, hard to grow, and hard to afford. Once it became familiar, it became ordinary. Like many imported things, tea, porcelain, spices, it started as a rarity, became a ritual, and ended as a routine. But unlike those other imports, the pineapple didn't survive as a staple. It had no caffeine, no preservative properties, and no practical application beyond novelty and display. And so it faded. From guarded greenhouses to rented centerpieces, from verse to canned slices, the pineapple's life in Britain followed a curve familiar to many. Once luxuries, a slow descent into domestic background noise. So the next time you see a pineapple in your kitchen or carved into a hotel bedpost, or garnishing a sticky upside-down cake cure, seeing the ghost of an empire's appetite. A fruit once too rare to eat and too revered to slice is now softened and sweetened for everyone. You might wonder what things today feel precious, strange, or elitenly because they're hard to get, and when they become common, they taste any better. Picture a wooden drawer. Grand. Not polished. It's just a rectangular box about the length of a man's forearm. It's fitted with metal sliders and a row of stiff cream-colored cards. Now imagine that drawer replicated 100 times, in quiet rows, in a room filled with soft lamplight and the scratch of pen nibs on paper. This, despite appearances, was the beating heart of Victorian bureaucracy, and its hero is the index card. In a world still built on ink and memory, it was this humble card thin enough to flip, stiff enough to file, that helped an empire keep track of its information. While steamships powered across oceans and telegraphs stitched the colonies together in real time, back in the offices of London and Liverpool, it was cards that kept the system from collapsing. This is the quiet, dusty story of how Victorians organized knowledge and how filing became not just necessary, but almost a moral duty. Paper everywhere. The early Victorian era was a time of paper explosions. Thanks to improvements in wood pulp production and cheap ink, paper flooded the market. Every office clerk, magistrate, doctor, or solicitor found themselves overwhelmed by letters, invoices, reports, and receipts. Even small government departments, like the Inland Revenue or the Board of Trade, might generate thousands of documents a year. And there were no digital folders, no spreadsheets, and no backups. Just piles. Piles tied with ribbon. Stacks crammed into pigeonholes. Ledger books so thick that a dropped one could snap a toe. As the bureaucracy of empire expanded, so too did the need to store, sort, and retrieve information faster than human memory allowed. Enter the indexing clerk. The British civil service, that bastion of quietly humming order, began appointing a new kind of office worker by the late 1830s, the indexing clerk. These were Minot's sole task, was to create records about records. That is, they didn't write laws or approve taxes or govern colonies. They filed things. And, more importantly, they made it possible to find them again. Their tools were minimal: a ruled ledger, a dip pen, a yardstick for shelf measurements, a set of handwritten reference slips, the ancestors of index cards. Each clerk kept a handwritten subject index, essentially a personal map of an ever-growing maze of documents. The most talented clerks had reputations for being able to locate a single letter written 8 years ago about a customs dispute in Bombay within 5 minutes. But this system relied heavily on human memory and interpretive skill. And that, reformers began to argue, was dangerously unscientific. The filing reformers entered the mid-century filing revolutionaries. Men like Charles Wheatstone, Melville Dewey, yes, that Dewey, and a lesser-known English organizer named Anthony Trollopeter, remembered today as a novelist than an administrative thinker. These men believed that knowledge must not only be produced, but also retrieved. And retrieval, they insisted, required standardization. Trollope, who worked at the post office for decades while also writing novels, believed passionately in the power of systematic filing. He advocated for alphabetical indexing, rigidly uniform card sizes, centralized record rooms, the training of filing staff with a focus on accuracy over ambition. His essays, buried in the pages of administrative journals, reveal a worldview in which filing was almost moral. A well-organized file room, he wrote, was a sign of honest labor, civilized foresight, and due regard for time. Birth of the index card. While card systems had existed earlier in rudimentary forms, think recipe cards or visitor logs, it wasn't until the 1850s and 60s that British offices began embracing standard-sized cards for institutional use. These cards, usually 5 by 3 inches, were kept in drawer systems sorted alphabetically or by subject. Each card would bear a brief heading and reference numbers that corresponded to longer documents, letters, or cases kept in the archive. The advantages were immediate. Cards could be reorganized without rewriting entire lists. New topics could be inserted at any time. Clerks didn't need to remember as much, they just needed to learn the system. Index cards, in short, offered scalability. Soon, entire departments were reorganized around the card. The Admiralty, the Board of Health, the Museum of Natural History all began deploying card indexes to track ships, diseases, specimens, and correspondence. The result was breathtakingly dull, but effective. The filing cabinet arrives to store these cards, A new piece of furniture entered the office: the filing cabinet. At first, they were adapted from printers' drawers and apothecary chests, but by the late 1860s, purpose-built wooden cabinets with metal runners and tabbed dividers became common. The great innovation wasn't just the cabinet height, was the vertical drawer. This simple shift from flat storage to upright allowed clerks to flick through cards the way one might shuffle a deck. It was fast, intuitive, slightly addictive. Some reports from the era note how indexing clerks would develop calluses on their thumbs from hours spent flipping, adjusting, and reordering. Office memoirs speak of men who refused tea until the cards were reconciled. Cards in the empire. One might wonder, did index cards matter beyond the office? Yes, more than most realized. Military logistics used index cards to track weapon shipments and personnel assignments. Colonial offices used them to record correspondence with far-flung governors and interpreters. Railway companies used them to manage schedules, freight logs, and lost property. The Royal Mail eventually adopted them to record change of address notices, making Britain one of the first nations to maintain a dynamic postal database. In an era when decisions about people, products, and punishment were made daily, cards became the interface between government and reality. They were small acts of order imposed on chaos. The quiet drama of losing a card index, cards also had a kind of fragile drama. Losing a single card might mean the loss of a court precedent, or a misfiled shipment of coal, or a forgotten debt owed by one department to another. In 1863, a minor scandal broke out when a misfiled card in the Admiralty index led to a 2-week delay in supplies to a Royal Navy outpost in the Falklands. The issue traced back to an overworked clerk who misalphabetized the term stromness under N instead of S, led to formal apologies and internal reform. The lesson was clear. A card was not just paper. It was a node in a growing web of state knowledge. The card as authority as filing culture grew, so too did the power of the card. To have something on file came to mean it had been acknowledged officially, bureaucratically, and permanently. Citizens wrote to agencies, not just for action, but to ensure their case was entered into the index. Entire careers began to revolve around managing cards, card supervisors, card auditors, and card clerks. In some circles, a well-kept card system was seen as more trustworthy than a living witness. One critic of this trend, our retired judge, grumbled in 1864 that Britain was no longer governed by ministers, but by file drawers. And perhaps he wasn't wrong. What comes next? By the mid-1860s, the index card was firmly entrenched in British institutional life, but filing culture was just beginning. In the coming decades, these cards would evolve into cross-reference networks, into centralized national databases, into the precursors of modern computing. But for now, in the soot-smudged offices of London, it was still about pen and card, filing, refilling, rearranging. The quiet choreography of paperwork. A strangely dignified ballet performed in silence day after day by men who believed that organizing the world was, in some small way, a noble act. So next time you toss a receipt or delete an email, you might ask, what pieces of your life would fit on a card? And what might be lost if no one ever filed them away? In the second half of the 19th century, while the public gaze was fixed on Queen Victoria, global exhibitions, and imperial expeditions, something far quieter unfolded in the back offices of Britain's institutions. It was there, amid gas lamps, ticking clocks, and the rhythmic flick of fingers over card edges, that the real machinery of the empire turned. Not in dramatic speeches or cavalry charges, but in cross-indexes, tabbed folders, the unwavering diligence of anonymous clerks. This is their story. The rise of the filing class. By 1865, filing was no longer a side duty or menial task. It had matured into a recognized profession, quietly spawning a new kind of civil servant, the career filer. These individuals, typically men from modest educational backgrounds, were trained not to create policy, but to ensure its traceability. Their prestige didn't come from invention, but from exactitude. While Victorian England was rife with reformers calling for sanitation, suffrage, and civil liberties, A quieter reform was occurring in the workplace. The demand for organizational clarity was no longer enough to know things. One had to know where things were kept and how to find them at once. Training to file to work as a filing clerk in a major department, say. The Home Office or the East India Company's Records Office meant passing a series of assessments. Alphabetical speed sorting tests, transcription from ledger to card, accuracy drills with numerical indexing systems, and perhaps most crucially, retrieval races. In one documented instance from the War Office in 1872, two senior clerks held an informal competition. Who could locate a 3-year-old memo on musket misfires from the Crimean front the fastest? The winner, 2 minutes, 17 seconds. Filing competitions weren't common, but stories like these passed among clerks like folklore. Accuracy was sacred, timing was legend. The filing room by the 1870s, many government departments had dedicated filing rooms, long narrow spaces with ventilation slats, high ceilings to accommodate wooden cabinetry, and tables designed specifically for laying out index systems. There were rules. No ink near the master index. No filing after dusk without a second clerk present for security. No personal annotations on cards, and absolutely no reordering of tabs without authorization. The filing room was, in its own quiet way, a temple. One 1876 description from the Foreign Office refers to the filing area as a place of muted reverence, where the names of nations were catalogued like specimens awaiting rediscovery. Women entered the card index as the clerical profession. Expanded, it also began tentatively to include women. At first they were hired in roles considered adjacent to filing, transcribers, typists, and readers for the blind. But with time, particularly in large institutions like the British Museum, women were employed in the more delicate aspects of card filing, particularly where cross-referencing required careful handwriting and patience. By the 1880s, several all-female index teams were managing portions of museum inventories, public health reports, and literary archives. Their presence was both progressive and practical. Women were paid less, yet delivered work that was frequently more legible and consistent. A 1884 report on the Museum of Natural History's herbarium file notes, the ladies assigned to the taxonomic index have introduced a clarity hitherto unseen in botanical record. It was faint praise, but praise nonetheless. The expansion of index domains originally created for tracking documents, the index card's role rapidly expanded into tracking people. Public health boards used them to monitor outbreaks, recording cases of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis across neighborhoods. The criminal justice system adopted cards to cross-reference aliases, court appearances, and prison sentences. Schools and poorhouses used cards to log names, entry and discharge dates, conduct notes, and cause of exit. Census offices, overwhelmed by growing populations, moved toward hybrid systems of ledgers and cards. In every case, the card became a proxy for a person, a slim rectangle that encapsulated a life, often reduced to key dates, one-word descriptions, and institutional codes. The morality of this reductionism, its benefits and dangers, was rarely debated. For most, it was simply efficient. Problems with perfection, and yet, despite its systemized order, the card index world had cracks. Card loss remained a persistent risk. Unlike books, which carried intrinsic value, index cards were small, loose, and vulnerable to water, fire, or misplacement. A single spilled ink pot, a dropped drawer, or even a poorly secured window could cause weeks of disruption. In 1878, an entire cabinet of medical index cards at St. Mary's Hospital was lost to flooding from a burst pipe. The cards soaked and illegible had to be reassembled from memory and scattered ledgers. One clerk reportedly did not speak. For days, human interpretation also remained a flaw. Filing systems varied across departments and even within them. Was a report on bathing habits in urban Liverpool filed under H. Hygiene? B. Bathing? U. Urbanism? L. Liverpool? There was no standard. And where there was no standard, there was always risk of invisibility. Cross-referencing. The next evolution, the real breakthrough, however, was cross-referencing. Clerks began writing references on multiple cards, creating networks of entries that linked reports, individuals, and concepts. One card might read, Cholera, Outbreak Deptford. C. Water Supply, 1874 Inspector. G.H. Naughton. This single card might connect to 5 others, and so on. What emerged was not just an index, but a primitive relational database, a web of connections only navigable through hours of quiet flipping. In essence, filing was evolving into thinking. Not thinking with ideas or arguments, but thinking with structure. Tension between memory and filing some traditionalists resisted. Long-serving clerks prided themselves on memorizing cases, on knowing by feel which shelf held which report. For them, the rise of cards seemed to reduce professionalism in the process. "You cannot file judgment," wrote one retired magistrate in an 1881 letter to the Spectator. "A mind governed by cards is a mind governed by others." This tension between organic memory and mechanical indexing would never fully disappear, but the tide was turning. The younger clerks, trained from the start in filing systems, saw the card index not as a limitation, but as freedom. It freed them from mental clutter, from uncertainty, and from duplication. It gave them mastery not of knowledge itself, but of access to knowledge. The unseen empire. By 1885, the British Empire was at its height, spanning continents, commanding navies, and shaping world politics. But if you had stepped behind the scenes past the diplomats, past the generals, past even the parliaments, you would have found a different empire, an empire of paper of drawers, and dividers of graphite scrawls and half-erased annotations of hand-tied bundles with tags marked "C also here." Power wasn't exercised with flags or armies, but with retrieval. To retrieve a document faster than your rival could cite it, to prove precedence with a date, to recall in seconds what others forgot in years. The empire of cards was the empire's spinal cord, invisible, methodical, and essential. As this century of filing deepened, so did its reach. What began as an aid to memory was becoming the memory itself. The idea that a single life or policy or pattern could be preserved on a piece of card was no longer novel. It was inevitable. But this raises a question we might carry forward. If we are remembered only by what is written on a card, who decides which words are used? By the final decades of the 19th century, the index card was no longer just a tool. It had become a mindset, a framework for organizing not only knowledge but life itself. As the filing cabinet became a fixture in government bureaus, libraries, shipping offices, hospitals, and schools, it also began to shape how people thought, how decisions were made, and most subtly, how society remembered. In this final section, we follow the card to its quiet triumph and explore how a simple rectangle of paper managed to outlive its makers. The cabinet era begins. Cabinets were once afterthoughts. Before the 1880s, index cards were stored in boxes, folders, or even simple drawers labeled with bits of ribbon. But the arrival of specialized furniture, sturdy, labeled, and lockable, was a sign that the card had taken on new authority. The Globo Init Company began selling standardized wooden filing cabinets in 1893, advertising them not merely as storage but as instruments of intelligence. Their brochures showed neatly dressed men waistcoated, spectacles in hand, retrieving a single card from a wall of labeled drawers. These ads were not subtle. Filing made a man look competent, trustworthy, and even virtuous. Owning a cabinet was no longer optional. It was expected. The file, as proof of existence, the shift was gradual but unmistakable. In earlier decades, being remembered required reputation. You needed to be written about in newspapers, spoken of in drawing rooms, and eulogized in letters. But now, in the age of filing, existence could be verified by your card. Criminal record was a card. An employment file, a card. A medical visit, a card. A school record, a card. A tax return, a card. If you lacked a card, there was no proof you'd been there at all. A man could live a full life, but if there was no card bearing his name, no indexed ledger, no entry in an alphabetical draw, history might forget him entirely. This was not sinister, merely bureaucratic. But bureaucracy is persistent. It becomes the default memory when human memory fades. The great consolidations around 1890, as empires and cities expanded, filing systems began to merge. Departments that once maintained independent indexes started consolidating their data into central registries. This was driven by necessity. Duplication wasted time, and lost records caused embarrassment. London's Metropolitan Police, for example, moved to unify their suspect index with that of the Home Office. The project took 2 years and involved more than 100,000 cards. Similarly, the General Post Office began merging internal personnel records with pension files, an act that required color-coded edge cuts, new labeling standards, and an entire new room of cabinets. The result? Cross-access, quicker decisions, less error. But it also meant that anyone with card access, a senior clerk, an investigator, a researcher, could now trace individuals through a web of connected institutions. In hindsight, this was the dawn of. Naturally, opposition emerged. Certain institutions clung to traditional systems, insisting that bound volumes provided superior durability and safety. Some pushed back on more abstract grounds, arguing that converting people into filing entries was inherently dehumanizing. A notable 1896 article in the Times Literary Supplement imagined a grim future where every man is reduced to a footnote in a ledger. But these critics were increasingly isolated, retired solicitors, village vicars, and aging custodians who still believed in vellum bindings and inked margins. The pace of life had shifted. The world was no longer slow. It was networked and immediate. Filing cards wasn't just quicker, they could be revised. A clerk could insert cross-reference, duplicate, remove, or annotate a card without having to redo the entire file. That flexibility was what made cards feel contemporary. Women, as the systems pulsed by the turn of the 20th century, women no longer made up a token presence in the filing office, they often dominated it. The increasing feminization of clerical roles, especially in postal departments, health institutions, and insurance agencies, transformed the inner workings of archival labor. Women brought not only clear handwriting and steady focus, but also a culture of teamwork. Filing departments were often divided into task clusters. One woman handled birth records, another monitored property, and another tracked obituaries. They established unwritten protocols when to extract a file, how to document updates, and who had authority to consolidate entries. These women rarely appeared in public accounts, but they were the quiet intelligence behind Victorian bureaucracy. Card by card, they kept the empire's systems aligned, precise, quiet, and enduring. The card abroad index card practices didn't remain within Britain's borders. They traveled with bureaucrats and colonial staff to distant outposts from India to West Africa to the Caribbean. In colonial Calcutta, British officials constructed an elaborate system to monitor laborers at docks and railway depots. In Lagos, public health authorities used drawer-based indexes to record outbreaks of tropical fevers. In Kingston, school children's academic and behavioral records were tracked through personal cards. These filing methods echoed British administrative logic but were modified locally, adjusting to unfamiliar scripts, titles, and hierarchies. What colonial administrators failed to notice was the contradiction. They were importing tools of supposed order to regions they deemed chaotic, yet often applying them to realities far too nuanced to fit a printed form. When the system couldn't accommodate complexity, it left it out. And in doing so, it determined how colonized lives were documented or erased. Institutional memory and mental shifts as card systems became the norm for cataloging and record keeping. A quiet shift unfolded in institutional psychology. Trust moved away from individuals and memory toward documents and data. Instead of consulting a colleague, one checked the file drawer. Instead of valuing spoken accounts, one relied on stamped paper. If it's not in the file, it didn't occur, became a common refrain. This new mindset reshaped behavior. Physicians began documenting cautiously, writing only what could be proven. Detectives routinely referenced growing criminal card indexes. Teachers jotted down codes that could follow a student for years. Employers reviewed personnel cards more closely than interviews. The cards ceased to reflect reality, became the standard of truth itself. The quiet legacy, by 1910, as the world edged into the electric age with telegraphs, typewriters, and early computing dreams, the index card remained. It weathered wars, revolutions, and ideologies. Its strength lay in its modesty, physical, sortable, and economical. In dim rooms filled with drawer slides and paper tabs, Victorian clerks had constructed a system, unremarkable but essential. Not heroic, not poetic, but enduring. A nervous system for an empire. It didn't seek glory, but in its persistence, it shaped how generations were remembered or faded into silence. Echoes in the present today, in the back rooms of the British Library, the Natural History Museum, or even an old Yorkshire registry office. You might still come across them. Wooden cabinets, their handles dulled with time drawers, marked 80 and neat. Faded labels, cards yellowed and curled, with delicate ink scripts the scent of adhesive, dust, and passing time. Each card, a whisper. Each drawer, a time capsule. Each cabinet, a quiet monument to an era when location was as valuable as information. And so we don't end with upheaval, but with repetition, routine, with the quiet realization that history isn't built solely by monarchs, conflicts, or manifestos, but by the unseen hands that filed, indexed, and silently ensured we would remember. But now that our files float invisibly in digital clouds, who is cataloging us today? Ornate garden building in Scotland completed in 1761, the stone pineapple atop the structure was not subtle. It stood 14 feet tall, carved in detail with spiraled fruitlets and leaves, and placed atop a classical rotunda. It was bizarre and unforgettable. The pineapple motif spread through British architecture and decoration, cast-iron pineapples on garden gates, pineapple finials on staircases, pineapple-shaped sugar molds, pineapple embroidery on handkerchiefs. And fans, it was an imported exotic that had come to symbolize both hospitality and mastery over nature. By placing a pineapple at the top of a building, family declared not only taste but also reach a connection to the colonial world too. Botanical innovation and too cultural fashion. Pineapples in painting and poetry, the fruit also found its way into the arts. Still life paintings from the late Georgian and early Victorian periods often feature the pineapple as a visual anchor. Its complex texture and color made it a challenge for artists and a point of pride to render correctly. Poets, too, indulged in pineapple language. O foreign sun, whose light hath ripened thee, and brought thy coral crown to Albion's hearth. We sip thy nectar not with tongues, but Isa, fruit of vision more than earthly birth. Miss B.F. Rothwell, 1821, there was something worshipful about how the pineapple was treated. It sat at the intersection of commerce, desire, and beauty. It's not quite religious, but not simply edible either. Behind the glamour, labor, and empire, of course, none of this glamour could exist without the vast machinery of empire. The pineapples were grown by enslaved workers in the Caribbean and Central America well into the 19th century. British consumers, wrapped in their silks and sipping tea at pineapple parties, rarely gave thought to the climate, labor, or violence behind the fruit's journey. Even domestically, workers who maintained greenhouses, often underpaid men and women, endured high temperatures, humidity, and long hours to keep these fragile crops alive for 2 years at a time. Yet their names are absent from history. The pineapple itself was lauded. The gardener's name, if recorded at all, was listed in the margin. Decline of the pineapple craze by the 1830s and 1840s. The pineapple craze began to wane. Improved shipping made the fruit more common. Sugar beet became a new agricultural focus. Tastes shifted toward other novelties, bananas, than mangoes. The The rise of industrial food production made delicacies less exclusive. A fixture of elite social life began to seem quaint, even ridiculous. Caricatures and satirical papers mocked the formality of such gatherings. One cartoon from Punch in 1842 shows a sour-faced matron admiring a pineapple under glass, while her guests sipped tea with expressions of suppressed boredom, and with that, the fruit receded back into normalcy. Still tasty, still decorative. No longer transcendent. What is a fruit worth, if not tasted? As we close this section, we're left with a strange paradox. A fruit grown for taste, loved for looks, passed around like a jewel, and sometimes never eaten. It raises a simple but nagging question. What makes a thing valuable? Is it the labor behind it, its scarcity, or merely what it symbolizes in the moment? What would it mean to hold something in your hands for show and never once take a bite? By the 1830s, pineapples in Britain were no longer confined to aristocratic greenhouses and rarefied drawing rooms. With global trade expanding and industrialization, reshaping daily life, the middle class was rising and it wanted in on the pineapple fantasy. Gone were the days when the fruit was too rare to eat. Now pineapples could be shipped more efficiently, sometimes canned, sometimes preserved in syrup. And with them came a new form of social performance, middle-class mimicry. This was a time when gentility could be purchased, a crinoline dress, a lace doily, a pineapple centerpiece. And though the fruit had begun to lose its aristocratic luster, it gained a different kind of power, aspirational elegance. The cult of the pineapple motif no longer content to be merely looked at. The pineapple became stylized a motif used across a range of domestic items. Pineapple-shaped jelly molds made of copper or pewter, pineapple-engraved teaspoons and cake servers, carved wooden pineapples atop hat stands, and bedpost pineapple doorknobs. Pineapple buttons and pineapple wallpaper borders. Manufacturers in Birmingham and Sheffield mass-produced these goods for department stores and catalogs. Middle-class households across Britain, and soon the United States, began displaying pineapple items not as rare trophies, but as tasteful embellishments. They weren't saying, "I have wealth beyond your imagining." They were saying, "I know what." Refined looks like even the Queen got involved. An 1847 edition of the Lady's newspaper noted, Her Majesty's breakfast table was adorned with a silver centerpiece of pineapples and roses, a tribute to tropical commerce and English industry. By now, the pineapple had become iconography, stripped of its original exoticism and reimagined as domestic charm, a pineapple for your parlor, the middle class. Home was undergoing a transformation in the 1840s-60s, with increased access to furniture and ornamentation. The parlor became the symbolic center of social life space for guests, gossip, and showing off one's station in the gentlest of ways. Pineapples were ideal for this new aesthetic, friendly, decorative, just a little bit foreign, and totally safe. Magazines, such as the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine, began publishing pineapple crochet patterns, instructions for pineapple-themed embroidery, and pineapple recipes that would never have been feasible a few decades earlier. Pineapple cake. With crushed, preserved pineapple from India, pineapple vinegar, cordial for hot weather, pineapple pudding steamed in iron molds shaped like the fruit itself. Cookbooks by authors like Eliza Acton included pineapple alongside other modern delicacies, like meringues and blancmange. The pineapple's earlier mystique had flattened into something more usably, and yet it was still proudly displayed. The era of the faux pineapple, not everyone could afford the real thing. But that didn't stop Victorian households from participating in the fantasy. Enter faux pineapples. Some were made of paper match, delicately painted and sealed with resin to give a glossy, ripened sheen. Others were carved from wood with green silk leaves and a dab of citrus oil to mimic scent. You could buy one from a mail-order catalog. 4 to South, 3D, and place it on your table year-round. It didn't rot, it didn't attract flies, and it had all the visual impact of the real thing. Shops even sold pineapple display domes glass bell jars to cover the fake fruit, turning it into a semi-permanent feature. What began as rarity had become replication. The imitation pineapple was more than just a substitute, it was part of the middle-class visual language of decorum, in the words of an 1859 etiquette guide, where the real is unattainable. The tasteful substitute well maintains the spirit of hospitality. Etiquette manuals and pineapple protocol this period saw a boom in guides for polite behavior. Victorian etiquette manuals were obsessed with the details of domestic performance, how to greet guests, how to fold napkins, and yes, how to serve and display pineapple. Consider the 1864 edition of Hints for the Hostess, which included a full page on proper pineapple usage. Never peel a pineapple in front of guests. Do so beforehand to preserve mystery. Slice pineapples thinly and fan them on a dish. Use silver tongs, not hands. Do not serve pineapple in the evening unless preserved. Fresh pineapple was considered a daylight delight. Never serve more than one pineapple dish per sitting. Excess suggests poor taste. These protocols gave form to the display of gentility. Pineapple service was no longer about the fruit itself, but about performing one's awareness of social nuance. And in that sense, it remained exactly what it had always been, a mirror for class identity. Pineapples in popular culture and advertising. As the 19th century marched forward, the pineapple's image began to appear in more commercial settings. Soap manufacturers used pineapples on their labels to suggest luxury and tropical freshness. Pineapple-scented perfume, often artificial, was marketed to young ladies as a way to capture the exotic bloom of youth. Even traveling shows and circuses used pineapple imagery. One 1862 handbill for Professor Stanhope's Phantasmagoria promised a tropical display of wonders, with rainforest tones and the great talking pineapple of Zanzibar. What that actually entailed is unclear, but audiences were intrigued. Children's toys also featured pineapples, miniature fruit stands, doll-sized fruit baskets, and early board games like the Grand Pineapple Chase, a vaguely colonial game of trade routes and fruit acquisition. A pineapple had passed the point of aspiration. It had become cultural shorthand, a smiley, spiny badge of taste. The transatlantic pineapple, while Britain had long been the epicenter of pineapple pageantry, America was quick to borrow the symbolism. In the U.S., pineapples had long been associated with Southern hospitality, especially in port cities like Charleston. In Savannah, Canada, American households, particularly in the Northeast, began adopting the pineapple as a common motif by the 1850s. You might see them carved on bedposts in New England, printed on parlor curtains embossed in silver teapots, and napkin rings. Hotels began including pineapples in their logos to signify welcome. Hostesses set out pineapple-shaped cakes at afternoon teas. The fruit had been fully democratized, but not at the cost of its charm. The pineapple's symbolic power outlasted its rarity, a testament to its unusual hold on the Victorian imagination. Decline, decay, and the next obsession. By the 1870s, the pineapple craze was finally running out of steam. Not because the fruit had fallen out of favor entirely, but because the pace of consumer culture had accelerated. New items arrived constantly from across the empire and beyond. Mangoes, kiwis, coconuts, spices, chocolates. The pineapple, once impossibly rare, was now reliably available in tins, on cakes, and even in jam for working-class homes. With reliability came banality. Satirical journals mocked pineapple-shaped everything. In one 1871 issue of Fun, a cartoon depicts a woman emerging from a home filled with pineapple wallpaper, pineapple carpets, a pineapple-shaped clock, and a parrot yelling pineapple. From its perch, the punchline, Mrs. Gableton's obsession, had reached its sour core. In a world moving faster each year, the pineapple, once miraculous, was now simply available. A fruit that reflected a nation, yet even as its social capital faded, the pineapple left a remarkable imprint. For nearly a century, single fruit-shaped. Table manners, architecture, etiquette, print culture, class aspirations, gender performance, domestic interior design. Its story is not just about food or horticulture. It's about meaning how ordinary things are invested with power by the people who display, describe, and desire them. And for a few bizarre decades in British history, no fruit was more laden with meaning than the pineapple. All spiky on the outside, golden within. You ever got the chance to actually eat it? By the final decades of the 19th century, Britain had entered an age of overabundance. The empire was vast. Steamships, railroads, and refrigeration had transformed the way goods moved. And even the pineapple, once a princely rarity, was now available in tins. But what do you do with an object once adored that no longer inspires awe?
Oh, the Victorians
Had an answer. Sentimentality. The rise of pineapple nostalgia. As pineapples lost their elite status, they gained something curiously Victorian: emotional weight. Old parlors still had pineapple-shaped sugar bowls and brass coat hooks. They became a kind of inherited charm, like antimacassars or porcelain cats, domestic artifacts from an earlier, more performative time. In the new Edwardian generation, young women would remember their mother's pineapple jelly set in the heavy mold, waiting to be unmolded with a whisper of steam. Grandfather's tale of eating real pineapple once at a garden party, where the mayor himself had sliced it with a silver knife. The pineapple-shaped button box passed from aunt to niece, never quite useful, never thrown away. About display. It was about memory. The colonial pineapple. Sweetness and exploitation, the pineapple's journey from the Americas to European. Greenhouses to middle-class dining rooms also carried darker threads. The Victorians rarely acknowledged. Much of the pineapple supply came from colonial plantations in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, where the labor that produced preserved pineapple, syrup, and vinegar was often underpaid, unfree, or built on the residual machinery of slavery. Even decades after abolition, while the British middle class daintily spooned pineapple jelly, workers in the colonies harvested, cut, and boiled the fruit in brutal heat. The sweetness of pineapple was not just a flavor, it was a commodity of empire. Only later, in the 20th century, would historians begin to interrogate this legacy. But even then, the pineapple remained curiously innocent in the Western imagination, a smiling fruit with spiky charm. Pineapple parties in the Gilded Age. By the 1890s, a new kind of pineapple party had emerged, particularly among American hostesses who loved reviving quaint British customs. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, themed events advertised, a tropical teaples and palms, colonial hospitality, a pineapple garden party, and corsets and conservatories, a pineapple soiree. These parties were part revival, part reinvention. No one was pretending the pineapple was rare anymore, but that wasn't the point. It had become symbolic shorthand for good taste, historical charm, whimsy, a knowing nod to old-fashioned gentility sometimes. Hosts even rented pineapple costumes for children or shaped meringue towers to look like the fruit. What had once been status performance was now aesthetic performance. Pineapples in domestic literature, household advice books of the 1890s still made mention of pineapples, but often in past tense. In former days, the appearance of a pineapple at table bespoke unusual hospitality. Though no longer a luxury, the fruit still graces many a festive board. An older cousin of the banana, once kept under glass, now seen on shelves at Woolworths. Children's books included pineapple references as well, sometimes wistfully. And atop the feast sat a jellied pineapple, like a crown made of sunshine. From the little parlor of Hesterfin, 1896, it was now part of the shared cultural wallpaper, the kind of thing you didn't question, like why fireplaces had mantles or why sugar tongs had birds on them. The long afterlife of the pineapple motif. While real pineapples became mundane, the pineapple as a shape, image, and icon proved stubbornly resilient. You'd still find pineapple-shaped newel posts in hotels, pineapple-topped Wather vanes on country houses, pineapple doilies in attic trunks. The symbolism never quite faded. Architects and decorators continued to use the fruit as a symbol of welcome and warmth. It was quietly installed in bed and breakfasts, in Devon porches in Charleston, guest towels in Dorset, and later in the 20th century, the pineapple would be picked up again by suburban home decor, from post-war garden gates to Florida motels to 1970s wallpaper. It had evolved into something comforting, familiar, a quaint echo of a time when pineapple meant effort, expense, and intention. When the pineapple became tacky, of course, no symbol is safe forever. By the mid-20th century, pineapples were everywhere. And as with anything that becomes ubiquitous, they became a little silly. Especially in the 1950s and 60s, when pineapple upside-down cake became an American staple. Pineapple rings were served with maraschino cherries and toothpicks at cocktail parties. Canned pineapple was used in ham recipes, Jell-O salads, and Polynesian meatballs. What had once been imperial luxury was now tinned whimsy, cloying, and kitschy. And yet, beneath the goofiness, a faint glimmer of past elegance still clung to the fruit. Even as TV dinners and party trays replaced crystal bowls and silver tongs, the pineapple remained. It always had. It always would. The modern echo today, you can buy pineapple print yoga mats, pineapple-shaped LED lamps, pineapple earrings, mugs, and phone cases. But the image has come full circle. The 21st century consumer, armed with Etsy, and Instagram is once again self-aware. The modern pineapple is playful, slightly ironic, vintaged and tinted, secretly sincere. Much like the Victorians who placed paper-match pineapples under glass domes. We too are participating in aesthetic nostalgia. We may not understand the depth of symbolism our great-grandparents attached to the fruit, but we know it meant something once, and that's often enough. A quiet conclusion: the pineapple never ruled nations, didn't end wars or launch revolutions. But it did sit quietly in drawing rooms, on sideboards and centerpieces, and in catalogs. It held the hopes of housewives and the pride of gardeners, soaked into the habits of hosting and the art of appearing refined. And through it all, it reflected something deeply human: our desire to impress, our craving for beauty, our gentle games of imitation. Our hope is that meaning might be found in a fruit. So the next time you see a pineapple carved into a bedpost, stitched into a napkin, or smiling up from a tropical drink menu, know that you're glimpsing a story that began in European greenhouses, bloomed in middle-class parlors, and never quite faded. A story not of kings or wars, but of taste, and imitation, and syrup. Sweet, boring, and magnificent. In the long, shadowy winters of 19th century Scandinavia, where snow settled early and the sun sometimes disappeared for weeks, there was no such thing as fresh produce. Not in January, not in February, and not in much of March or April. Either this was a world where life had to be stored, or what you ate in January depended entirely on what you managed to preserve in August. And so, the Scandinavians turned to a miracle of human ingenuity that was equal parts science, thrift, and culinary surrender. Pickling. A land of cold and cellars, Scandinavia, then a mosaic of Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and Finnish territories was. Not uniformly frozen, but its agricultural calendar was short. For many, the growing season lasted barely 100 days. What grew had to be harvested, eaten quickly, or somehow made to last. Cabbage, onions, beets, carrots, and fish were the most reliable staples. But unlike southern Europe, where fruits could be sun-dried and meats smoked under endless summer skies, northern kitchens faced a different reality. There simply wasn't enough sun nor steady warmth for drying to be effective most of the year, and so root cellars became national treasures. Underground storage pits lined with straw and timber held barrels of pickled things, packed tightly with brine or vinegar, sealed with wax and hope. And the pickles were not just sides or condiments, they were dinner. The pickling trinity: vinegar, salt, and sugar. By the early 1800s, Scandinavian households had developed a surprisingly formal set of pickling techniques. 3 dominant methods prevailed, each tied to the local environment and trade. Most common in rural Norway and Finland, where access to imported goods was limited, vegetables were packed with salt to draw out liquid, creating their own fermentation bath. Sauerkraut-style cabbage and fermented turnips became essential for surviving the darkest months. Vinegar pickling, popular in Sweden and Denmark, where colonial trade routes brought barrels of imported wine vinegar. Beets, cucumbers, pearl onions, and even apples might be sliced, packed into stoneware crocks. and doused with hot vinegars, sometimes spiced with cloves, mustard seeds, or dill. Sweet pickling, especially prominent in Swedish Christmas fare. Here, vinegar and sugar were blended to preserve herring or mixed root vegetables. The sugar not only masked vinegar's harshness, but also helped draw out water and extend shelf life. To the uninitiated, sweet pickled fish may sound alarming. To a Swede in 1825, it was a cause for celebration. The ritual of pickling season each year, late summer, brought not only harvest but also the pickling season, a quiet, industrious time. In rural households, especially among the working class, this was one of the few food preparation events that involved the entire family. Fathers might lift and clean the heavy barrels. Mothers would slice vegetables with alarming speed. Children helped rinse, layer, and pack the jars. Recipes were rarely written. Instead, they were handed down by demonstration: how the brine should smell, when to add more vinegar, and how tightly to tamp the lid. In some Swedish towns, there were even neighborhood brining parties, where multiple families gathered to collectively prepare the winter stores. Jokes would be exchanged. Salt-crusted fingernails. The smell of vinegar hung in the air for days, and by the time the first frost arrived, the larders were full. Pickled beets in earthenware jars, salted cucumbers in wooden barrels, and herring fillets layered like fragile documents in brine. To a modern observer, it might all seem dull, sour, or unappetizing. But for a 19th century Scandinavian family, these jars were life itself. Pickled proteins, fish first, meat rarely, fish particularly, herring was the crown jewel of Scandinavian pickling. Easy to catch, difficult to store, and prone to rot in coastal humidity, herring was an ideal candidate for pickling, and it could be preserved in countless forms: salt cured and brined for daily consumption, vinegar pickled with onions and peppercorns for festive occasions, spiced and sweet pickled for holidays like Julbord, the Christmas table in Sweden. A layered dish of pickled herring, potatoes, and hard-boiled egg yolks was considered almost decadent. Norwegians, meanwhile, favored rikefisk, a fermented trout dish buried in salt and left to age in cellars for months. Not technically pickled, it still followed the same preservation logic. Salt, containment, and time was rarer. When available, pork or game might be cured or smoked, but it was seldom pickled unless prepared for very long journeys. That said, some wealthier households experimented with vinegar-pickled sausages or preserved tongue knot for flavor, but for practicality. Even the wealthier classes understood. In this land, freshness was fleeting, and vinegar was insurance. Cultural etiquette around pickled food: because pickled items could be pungent, there developed a peculiar kind of table etiquette around their use. In polite society, one was not to comment on the sourness of a guest's pickle, no matter how aggressive the vinegar. Strong jars were common containers. Accidentally over-pickled or left too long, these might cause guests to flinch, sweat, or quietly weep from the nostrils. But saying so, it's inappropriate. At formal gatherings, the pickled items were often served in cut glass dishes, their bright colors on display like jewels. Beets offered deep reds, onions, an icy translucence, and gherkins, a steady green. They weren't just food, they were visual proof of a household's preparation, skill, and taste. And every guest would understand. This dinner was made in August, and it is still feeding us in February. But how did a culture so defined by preservation eventually treat pickled food as festive, even luxurious? And how did the humble vinegar jar make its way onto royal buffets and Christmas tables with pride? That's the story we'll explore in the next chapter. By the middle of the 19th century, pickling in Scandinavia had undergone a quiet transformation. What had once been a purely pragmatic activity, a necessary labor to guard against, starvation began to acquire layers of tradition, ritual, and even prestige. It wasn't that the vinegar became more refined or the fish any fresher. Rather, pickled food moved from the root cellar to the dining room, and in doing so, it took on new meanings. Some households still packed pickled cabbage by candlelight, whispering complaints about how long the jars must rest. But in others, especially in towns and among upwardly mobile families, pickles became seasonal centerpieces, signs of cultivation, and even proof of one's moral discipline. Strangely, it was precisely because pickled food was once so unremarkable that it became a source of pride. Pickling as a measure of respectability as urbanization crept through Scandinavia in the 1850s and 60s. Small towns gave rise to new social classes, modest clerks, retired military officers, widowed teachers, and small-scale merchants. Many of them had left the countryside, but they hadn't left behind its lessons. One of those lessons, preparedness, was a virtue. Being seen as prepared for winter, with jars of pickled goods stacked neatly and labeled, implied not just competence, but character. It meant you were prudent, clean, organized, respectable. The early temperance movement in Sweden, which began around the 1830s and strengthened through the century, indirectly encouraged this ethos. Drinking was frowned upon, but vinegar was wholesome, so it followed that the household that mastered pickling could also claim to master restraint. It was preservation of food, yes, but also preservation of self, by the 1860s even. Recipe books began to hint at this subtle status. In Swedish housewife manuals, such as Hemmets Kokbok, the Home's Cookbook, pickling instructions were increasingly specific, even ceremonial. The beets must be trimmed with clean hands only. A dull knife bruises the root. Vinegar should be brought only to the second boil. This kind of precise language wasn't about flavor. It was about dignity. The rise of the jolbird. Holiday pickles take the stage. Of all seasonal meals in Scandinavia, none rivaled jolbird, the traditional Christmas buffet, from Norway to Sweden and beyond. This winter feast combined pagan roots with Christian festivity, and by the 19th century, it had become a national institution. And right in the center of the jolbird, pickled herring, usually served 3 plain. Brined, spiced, and sweetened with sugar and onions, the herring wasn't merely tolerated at these festive tables. It was cherished. It marked continuity, it announced. Without words, we survived another year. Jolbird was an elaborate spread, often including cured meats, roasted pork, dense rye breads, cheeses, and mulled wine. But no matter how luxurious, the additions became, it was the humble jars, opened with a gentle pop of the wax seal, that tied everything together. In fact, many households began preparing special pickles just for this meal. These weren't everyday staples. These were curated, aged, and gently flavored batches, sometimes only opened once a year. Caraway-iced carrots, sweet pickled pearl onions, hot cucumbers set aside since midsummer. To serve them was not just to offer food, it was to demonstrate foresight and festivity in one spoonful. Pickling and the rise of the recipe book as literacy improved throughout the 1800s. Especially among women, the Scandinavian cookbook underwent a quiet boom. No longer handed down only through demonstration or oral tradition, pickling techniques began appearing in printed volumes. In Finland, cookbooks like Pitokirja Talonpajil, a cookbook for peasants, offered preservation methods tailored to frugal homes. In Denmark, recipe almanacs included monthly pickling schedules. Carrots in July, mushrooms in August, and cucumbers always in September. These books standardized pickling and elevated it. One didn't just put away cabbage anymore. One made Nordisk vitkål in lagged eye, finger Nordic cabbage preserved in vinegar. The language of pickling became more formal, even a bit poetic. Authors described brines as delicate, vinegar as sharp as December wind, onions rendered soft by sweet sleep and sugar. Pickling, in short, became worthy of writing down. And once something is written down, it becomes teachable, transferable, and eventually a point of pride. Glassware, display, and the pickled aesthetic. As Scandinavian middle classes rose and imports became more affordable, one shift in pickling practice stood out dramatically: the transition from storage jar to display jar. Where previous generations kept their pickles in dark cellars, in reused barrels, or in ceramic crocks, the mid-1800s saw a boom in clear glass pickling jars, especially imported ones. Glass jars allowed pickles to be displayed on shelves. their colors could be admired. The cleanliness of the vinegar, the neatness of the vegetable cuts, and the suspended herbs all now visible through polished crystal, while many households began keeping a pickle shelf in the kitchen or pantry. Sometimes this was practical. Often, it was decorative. Visitors might admire the clarity of a beet pickle. A jar layered with pale pink radish rings and bright green dill sprigs might be arranged like a bouquet. Pickling was no longer a task of desperation. It was a quiet kind of art. Pickled diplomacy, royal banquets, and formal tables, though pickling began in peasant kitchens. It eventually reached royal tables too. At the court of King Oscar II of Sweden and Norway, reigned 1872 to 1907. Menus from formal dinners included pickled mushrooms, spiced cucumbers, and even delicately pickled lemon slices, an exotic rarity imported from Mediterranean trade. Inclusion of pickled dishes was not a coincidence. It signaled tradition and sophistication in one move. To serve pickled beetroot beside a roast goose meant not only that the palace was lavish, it meant it was Scandinavian. Indeed, in diplomatic dinners between Scandinavian countries, national pride often took root in these small culinary gestures. A Danish diplomat might insist on pickled red cabbage. A Swedish one might counter with sweet pickled herring. Everyone knew what they were doing. Pickles, in their quiet way, spoke of identity. Industrial pickling, and the threat of convenience by the 1880s. However, the old art of home pickling faced its greatest rival, mass production. Canning factories, which first emerged in England and the United States, soon reached the Nordic markets. Glass jars of store-bought pickled onions, cucumbers, and fish began appearing in general stores. Labels boasted consistent flavor. No spoilage, hand-packed. For some, this was a blessing. No more brining sessions or failed fermentations. No more beet stains or broken jars. But others mourned the change. To buy pickles was to lose a measure of control and of meaning. A purchased jar might taste fine. It might even look better, but it wasn't yours. It wasn't layered by your hands. It didn't rest in your cellar. A small but telling cultural resistance emerged. Cookbooks began emphasizing home method pickling. Church magazines printed moral essays about preserving not just food but tradition. In some towns, you could tell which families still pickled. By hand, by the vinegar smell on their laundry, or the wax rings on their pantry lids. And among older generations, the old saying held, "A house without a pickle jar is a house already starving." By the century's end, Scandinavia stood at a crossroads, caught between modern convenience and ancestral ritual. Pickling had grown from a survival skill to a social signal, from a cellar necessity to a festive centerpiece. But with factory, jars on every shelf, and urban life accelerating, would the old tradition survive? Would the grandchildren of vinegar-stained housewives still know how to layer carrots and dill? And would pickled herring continue to grace holiday tables or become a relic of a slower, colder world? By the last decade of the 19th century, the scent of vinegar no longer signaled survival. It drifted now from smaller kitchens, humbler shelves, and aging hands. The grand days of communal brining and meticulous layering had passed their peak. Across Scandinavia, the quiet old art of pickling found itself cornered not by disdain, but by forgetting. The world was changing. Steamships carried Scandinavians to North America. Industrial food systems began offering everything from canned peas to vacuum-sealed fish. And younger generations, chasing new lives, often found little reason to carry jars of carrots soaked in caraway. Still some did. In fact, the final chapter of traditional Scandinavian pickling wasn't written in a farmhouse in Småland or a Copenhagen cellar. It was written in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the cold edge of Manitoba. Because what is preserved in the end is never just food. Pickles in a suitcase. Migration in memory between 1860 and 1920. Nearly 2 million Scandinavians left their homelands for the Americas. Norwegians sought farmland. Swedes fled poverty. Finns, especially from Karelia, escaped Russian military service. Danes drifted toward prairie towns. They carried what they could: Bibles, silver brooches, baby clothes, and often tucked among them recipes, These were usually scribbled on soft paper, copied in pencil from grandmother's books, or simply remembered by rote. Boil beets till they sigh, one might say. 3 parts vinegar, 1 part sugar. Never cut onions on Sundays. For many immigrants, these pickled traditions were anchors, quiet ways to stay connected to lost places. By the early 1900s, entire communities in Minnesota and North Dakota celebrated lucifus or jewel board, with dishes their ancestors once served along fjords or forests. On those long, dark winter nights, pickled fish and cabbage weren't just food. They were ritual, a way to say, we remember. And in immigrant newspapers like Svenska, Amerikanska Posten, readers wrote in asking for pickling advice. Is white vinegar acceptable if no malt vinegar is found? How long must beans soak before they may be put away for winter? My daughter dislikes onions, Will. She'll still marry well if she never learns to layer them. Old traditions clung gently to new soil. The last briners, women, time, and 10,000 jars as the 20th century dawned. The task of pickling rested mostly with women, particularly those who had not left their rural roots behind. In towns across Sweden and Norway, you could still find shelves lined with jars, golden carrots, dusty beets, and pungent herring glinting in spice-laced brine. But these jars belonged to mothers, grandmothers, or quiet aunties who rarely taught. Explicitly, they expected the knowledge to be absorbed, some of them measured with pinches, others with broken teacups. A good brine was felt in the hand, not calculated. A pickle's readiness was judged by the clarity of its liquid, not the date on a label. These women, without realizing it, became the final keepers of a world. As early as 1905, school curriculums in cities no longer included fermentation or preservation. Girls were taught sewing or hygiene instead. Pickling, once a mark of discipline, became faintly old-fashioned. And yet there were still quiet moments. In a dim kitchen in Tromsk, a 70-year-old woman might still check a row of cloudy jars, tapping the lids with her finger. In the corner of a Swedish-American home in Iowa, a granddaughter might be coaxed into slicing cucumbers the thin way, even if she wasn't quite sure why. The Museum of Pickles. What we chose to remember in 1919, curious collection was catalogued in the Swedish Folk History Archive in Uppsala. Dozens of handwritten pickle recipes sent in by elderly women from all across the countryside. One was simple. Each one is different. Carrots with clove, beets with juniper, even a vinegar syrup for soothing digestion. The archivists didn't entirely understand what they had. They thought of it as folk food. But what they'd captured was the end of a generational chain. Some of these recipes had no measurements. Others referenced tools no longer made. One, in faded ink, read simply, "If the house smells like sour apples on the 3rd day, all will be well." By 1930, many of these dishes had disappeared from daily life, but they lingered in memory. And occasionally in museum jars, dusty, discolored, their contents long spoiled, but their labels still legible. Pickled identity, trapped in time. The taste that lingered, echoes in the modern kitchen, and yet pickling never truly vanished. In Denmark, holiday surseled sour herring remained a staple. In Sweden, inlagged gurka sweet pickled cucumber was served alongside meatballs at cafeterias. In Norway, rydbeter pickled beets appeared on dark bread sandwiches, even mass-produced. These foods carried echoes of the old cellars, the old women, and the old winters. In fact, a quiet revival began first among cultural nostalgists, later among food enthusiasts. By the late 20th century, small workshops and home cooks rediscovered the practice. It was no longer about survival, or status, or even winter. Now, it was about flavor, about connection, about choosing slowness in a fast world, and strangely that brought things full circle. The modern Scandinavian kitchen, with its minimalist shelves, curated spices, and glass jars filled with lemon thyme. Carrots is not so different from the display shelves of 1885. The jars shine again. They speak again. They preserve again not only what we eat, but what we miss. Closing reflection, what we really keep when we think of history, we picture wars, kings, parliaments and railroads, but in quiet corners of kitchens, of diaries, of cellar shelves, there are softer kinds of history. Histories of routine, of taste, of hands doing the same work for 100 years. To pickle is to touch time. It is to say, this moment matters enough to save, and even if the beet softens, even if the onions go pale, even if the jar is opened long after the maker is gone, there's still something of them in the brine.